The story begins with the fact that Irene is an ordinary girl from a large family who was able to get a position as a maid at the imperial court. It was customary that the maids and servants of the imperial court were never supposed to show their emotions. But it was difficult for Irene because the second prince Theo is a beautiful blue-eyed blonde. Servants are the property of the imperial family, and they had to always remember this. They had to obey at all times under any circumstances. The man wanted the girl to be more than a servant for him. The events took place several years ago in the imperial palace of Veronica. One by one, the maids asked Irene for advice. The poor women did not know how to behave properly. The experience of living with a bunch of brothers and sisters turned out to be so useful for the girl. She gave very effective advice to her colleagues. Irene's father died in the war, and her mother was seriously ill. Because of this, the girl had to feed the whole family herself. It was difficult to survive on a small village salary. For this reason, Irene seized with all her might the chance to become a servant at the imperial palace. After 2 months of work, the girl evaluated her life in the capital and her salary. According to Irene, her job was pretty easy. She served a princess named Lauren Veronica. The lady was very satisfied with the girl's work because she diligently performed it. Lauren Veronica is a beauty with blue eyes and blonde hair. The lady respected her servant because she had a good heart. One day, the princess was going to a banquet, for which Irene was preparing her. The girl kindly offered to take Lauren. The second brother of the princess was supposed to return that day. Irene had never seen him before. Lauren sincerely hoped that this ruffian would not quarrel with His Majesty. It was still a feast in honor of the emperor. The second prince of the empire, Veronica, is a captain of the Order of Knights. But despite his high status, there were rumors about his rude and unrestrained character. Walking down the long corridor, Lauren felt her feet begin to ache excruciatingly. The lady thought that the shoes were too small for her. One of the maids mistakenly brought shoes smaller than the princess needed. Irene tried to think of a way out of the situation as soon as possible because the banquet was supposed to start in 5 minutes. Lauren, lifting her dress, looked at her fragile legs and realized that she could not walk at all. The pain was so bad that Lauren could barely stand. Irene, lowering her eyes, looked at her revenge. They were recently given to the girl by her mother. The woman once heard that the emperor's servants wore just such clothes and decided to give her daughter a gift. For a moment, the girl forgot everything, but thought about her mother, who was grateful to her for her tireless work. The woman then felt very sad because she could not help her daughter get into the Marks Academy, which the girl had dreamed of for so long. Irene was very happy with such a wonderful gift and hugged her mother tightly. Throughout her life, the woman gave her daughter everything she could. Irene didn't want to ruin her mother's gift, so she rarely wore clothes. The girl, after thinking a little, decided to offer the princess to wear her clothes. They were the same size, and Lauren needed them now more than she needed them. Irene took off her shoes and bent down to put them on the princess's feet. Meanwhile, the girl hastened to find shoes in which the princess would be comfortable. The shoes had to look good and match the dress. After Irene had completed such an important task, she sat down on the bench exhausted. The girl was happy that she managed to avoid problems because the shoes were not visible under the princess's dress. Due to the fact that the girl was running barefoot, her feet got a good deal. She was sorry to destroy her mother's gift because her feet were dirty. So Irene was in no hurry to put on her shoes. Someone suddenly sat down on the bench next to Irene. The girl was scared out of her wits. She did not know the man who was next to her. It was a handsome, blue-eyed brunette. At first, the girl looked at Mr. in silence for a long time. When she came to her senses, she thought that it might be a nobleman, and she shouldn't have stared at him like that. The man took out a cigarette and complained about today's bad day. It seemed that this gentleman was in no mood at all. Irene was even a little scared. She decided it was best to get up and leave. Suddenly, Irene inhaled the smell of forget-me-nots. It seemed to her that it was the smell of a man nearby. The man behaved quite strangely, but noticed that the girl had strange hobbies. Pan looked at Irene's feet in surprise because they were bare, and the shoes were right on the girl's lap. Irene wanted to avoid all the details and not tell the whole truth to a stranger. Irene remembered that servants should keep their mouths shut at all times and everywhere, no matter who was in front of them. Any word of the girl could harm Her Majesty. The man asked Irene with interest if she was not in pain. The girl's legs were all bruised, and he had never seen such a wonder before. Irene lowered her eyes, not understanding what this man needed. The girl did not know what to do. She wanted to leave, but she didn't want her husband to see her walking around barefoot. Irene caught her husband's gaze. He looked at her for a long time without taking his eyes off her. Irene decided to leave anyway, because she did not have the strength to sit any longer. The man suddenly stood up, and the girl was frightened. The man was concerned by this behavior and asked if everything was okay. The girl was overjoyed that this annoying man was going to leave. But the gentleman sat next to the girl, which surprised her a lot. He pulled out a handkerchief and began to wipe Irene's dirty feet. She was wrong, thinking that he would finally leave. At first, Irene was not happy with what her husband was doing. Later, she was even pleased, because no one cared about the girl so much. Irene even felt tickles on her feet. She was grateful to her savior because he rewound her legs, asking her to treat the wounds later. The man abruptly got up from his knees, said goodbye, and left. Irene watched him for a long time until the man disappeared from her sight. The events took place 3 years later. One of the maids entered Irene's room anxiously. Becoming a servant of a princess is already an achievement, but being promoted to the head of servants in the palace was simply incredible. Irene, being the chairwoman, was filling out some paperwork. The maid came to report that the crown prince's suit had already arrived and awaited further instructions. Irene believed that it should be immediately transferred to the crown prince's office. The maid was surprised, because usually the man changed his clothes in his room. The prince had to have a meeting before the invited dinner. Crown Prince Evan Veronica believed that there would be no problems with the invited dinner. But one more meeting was hung on him, because he was considered quite reliable. Meanwhile, the maids, looking at the relief body of the Corn Prince, helped him to get dressed. Irene encouraged her husband, telling him that the emperor believed in him and therefore entrusted him with such an important job. Irene felt tired because the more work Evan had, the more she had. A year ago, when the girl still worked for the princess, everything was much simpler. Irene deftly fastened the buttons on the prince's shirt. A man entered the room to warn His Majesty Theo of his arrival. It was the same second prince, the captain of the Order of Knights. The prince was surprised that Theo had arrived at the party. 3 years ago, the Veronica Empire was attacked by barbarians with the support of the Silverini Empire. The stronghold of the war was a border fortress, whose soldiers had a hard time. Even the second prince, the head of the entire army, had to join the battle. The war lasted 9 months. During this time, even aristocrats joined the battle. The empire was able to survive with the combined forces, but the news reached the palace that the second prince was seriously wounded, and because of this, he was immediately sent to the temple. While Irene helped Evan get ready, she listened to a fascinating story. Evan was very happy about the meeting that was about to take place, because he and Theo had not seen each other for 2 years. Due to the fact that Theo's wounds were very deep, the servant could not believe that Theo had recovered and was so strong. Evan assured that Theo became the captain of the Order of Knights because he is very strong, courageous, and brave. The prince thanked Irene for the fact that she tried so hard and helped him get ready for such an important event. After some time, Evan arrived at the meeting place. The princess and her father were quite happy that the prince found time to attend their feast. Lauren, seeing Irene, threw herself into her arms. The girl served her well in her time, so the lady had only the best opinion about Irene. Lauren invited Irene to come back to her again. It seemed to the lady that the girl had lost weight and wasted away. Irene denied everything, but said that everything was fine in her life. Prince was paying her a lot more than Lauren used to, so that was a very strong argument for her to stay with him. But the girl was pleased with such attention from the princess. Gossip spread around the hall that Theo would definitely come to the banquet. The noble was surprised that the man recovered so quickly. No one could believe in his integrity. The emperor admitted that Theo had recovered 3 months ago, and he didn't come back because he trained every day to get back in shape. The man himself could not understand Theo, although he is his son. Irene breathed in and smelled the scent wafting through the air. It was the smell of memories that she felt when she was near a stranger. Theo entered the hall. He could hear Lauren not speaking very well of him. This did not upset the man, because it had always been like that. The princess turned away from Theo, but did not even want to shake his hand. The emperor was worried about his son's health. He asked Theo how he was doing and how he was feeling. Lauren stood indignant because her brother, getting down on one knee, bowed to the emperor. It was knightly etiquette that Lauren should have known. Irene was sure it was the stranger who sat down and talked to her and wrapped a handkerchief around her foot. The man's appearance was the same, and this amazing smell was the same. But the color of the stranger's hair was different. Irene and Theo met 3 years ago. This was one time when nobles and common soldiers had to fight hand to hand. The girl was sure that he was there too. She prayed for his life every day. Irene really wanted them to meet again. The girl was surprised by the fact that Theo used to have black hair. Everything was the same. Appearance, smell, figure. Only the hair color differed. Irene could not take her eyes off her husband. It seemed impossible. She had the idea that if this was not the same man, then he looked suspiciously like him. Behind her, the girl heard the servants whispering. One of the girls said that His Majesty had sent a doctor with magic to heal the second prince Theo. Irene concluded that magic had changed Theo's hair color. If the doctor did use magic, then everything came together. Even the girl knew that magic could leave some traces behind. The evening has come. Everyone left. Irene lay down on the bed exhausted. She was very tired that day. She was haunted by the thought of the prince. The man had just returned to the palace, and the girl had already become tense. Irene bent down and began to rummage under the bed. She was looking for a chest. Finding and opening it, she saw 2 handkerchiefs. These were exactly the handkerchiefs Theo used to wrap Irene's injured legs. The girl previously had guesses that the stranger was a nobleman. Irene could not even think that he would turn out to be the second prince of the empire. She tried to forget and trample her feelings. The girl understood that she was an ordinary servant and was not worthy to feel something for His Majesty. Although she tried to calm herself down, her heart continued to ache. The morning has come. Irene quickly came to Evan's office, who was already waiting for her. On the sofa lay a suit for the longevity of the empire ceremony, which was too big for a man. Evan was sure his measurements were mixed up with Theo's, and he insisted Irene check. The girl, hearing about Theo, became confused. She started slurring her words a little and talking nonsense. When the girl left, the prince thought about her behavior. He was surprised to see such an unusual reaction from Irene. He knew the girl well, and he saw this for the first time. Irene knocked on Theo's room. The girl said loudly that she had come on behalf of His Majesty Evan. The room was empty. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. Irene saw the same suit on the sofa. She wanted to check which one was bigger. It turned out that the sizes were really confused. Irene carefully took Theo's shirt. This was the first man who took care of her. The girl forced herself not to show any emotions. She swore to herself that her heart would not tremble again. Holding the shirt, Irene thought. Theo had not been in the palace for 2 whole years, so the girl was sure that his wounds were terrible. Irene raised the shirt to her face and inhaled its scent. The shirt smelled of forget-me-nots. The girl enjoyed such a gentle and pleasant smell. Irene suddenly recovered, but scolded herself for what she had done. She looked around to make sure no one had seen it. When she turned her head, Theo was standing by the door. The girl immediately dropped her shirt on the floor. She was so ashamed that she lowered her eyes. Irene asked the prince how long he had been watching her. The man said he entered when Irene grabbed his shirt and brought it to her face. The girl's eyes became wide, and fear took over her whole body. Theo did not like that a stranger was sniffing his shirt in his own room. Irene's hands trembled. She confessed that she had committed a mortal sin. The girl turned around and quickly ran out of the room. Irene blamed herself for what she had done. She understood that she must have gone mad. A bunch of thoughts were swirling in her head, which were not at all in favor of the girl. Irene was worried about Theo's opinion of her. She thought that she would be very lucky if the prince would just forget about this misunderstanding. Irene tried to calm herself down. First of all, the suit had to be returned to Mr. Evan. The girl was quite upset, because she had forgotten the suit in Theo's room. She was very ashamed to return, but there was no choice. Having calmed down, Irene realized that the costume would not come to her by itself, and she had to accept reality. She gathered courage and went to the prince's room. The girl knocked and entered. With her head held high, she informed Theo that Prince Evan had sent her here to change the costumes that had gotten mixed up. Irene wanted to take the suit and leave as soon as possible. Lowering her eyes, Irene begged the prince's forgiveness for disturbing him. Instead, the man approached her. He looked intently into Irene's eyes and informed her that they had met before. Irene could not believe her ears. Theo also asked what the girl was doing with the shirt. Irene did not know how to explain everything so that Theo would understand correctly. She just sniffed the shirt because it smelled nice. The girl wanted to leave Theo's room as soon as possible because it seemed to her that the man considered her a pervert. The prince wanted to hear the name of the girl standing before him. Irene thought she might be demoted, or worse. The girl was silent and stood motionless. Theo was still waiting for Irene to say her name. Servants had only one purpose, which was above all others. One could never contradict Mr. the Man was still waiting for an answer to his question. The girl's legs were simply taken away from nervous overexertion. Irene fell to the floor. Theo saw a badge on the girl that indicated a high position. The man knew that there were no more than 10 such badges in the palace. The girl gave up and said her name. She had a bad feeling. Later, when Irene was next to Evan, pouring him tea, Theo came. The man came so often that Irene found it strange. Evan kindly invited them to meet. Theo said that they already know each other, and he knows that Irene is his personal servant. Theo asked the girl to go out the door. He wanted to ask Evan something. To the man's great surprise, the brother asked him to give Irene to him. Evan inquired about his brother's intentions. He didn't fully understand why he wanted this particular girl. Evan decided that Theo liked Irene. Theo explained that during the first week of dating, he realized that Irene was attracted to him. Evan did not really want to let this particular servant go, because it would be difficult to tear her away from his affairs. The man offered other servants. Evan explained that Irene used to be Lauren's personal servant, but then he took her in and hanged the heads of the servants. Theo did not understand why he had to listen to such details. Evan said that the 3 of them needed Irene. Theo said he wasn't going to steal his brother's servant, but the look on his face spoke for itself. Evan decided to give in to his brother. He only asked to respect the girl. Theo, who got what he wanted, was satisfied. Evan understood that in case of refusal, the brother would go to his father and ask for his help. So the man did not have much choice. Evan asked his brother to protect himself, realizing that he had not yet recovered from his injury. They exchanged a few more words, and Theo left. Evan found his brother's behavior strange because he was not at all like himself. The man remembered old events that were connected with his brother. Once upon a time, when Theo was still small, the priest told him that the boy would live to be 23 years old, according to God's will. 3 years have passed since Theo turned 23. Just 3 years ago, the war with the Silverini began. Then Evan was sure that his brother would die in the war. He was overjoyed that everything had ended well, and Theo had survived. Evan lay on the sofa, lost in his thoughts. The man understood that he needed to warn Irene as soon as possible that she would no longer serve him, but her brother. Meanwhile, Irene was looking out the window. She was constantly thinking about Theo, and she did not know how to make him forget about her. At that moment, Theo came very close to her and began to whisper something in her ear. Theo scared the girl very much. Irene shuddered. She wondered if Theo had finished talking to his brother yet. The girl could not even think that they were talking about her. Irene was frightened by such words. She did not understand what was being said. Theo was clearly acting very loose. The man asked if Irene wanted anything else. The girl continued to look at Theo with incomprehension. The man came closer to Irene and directly asked if she did not want him. The girl seemed to have water in her mouth. She did not expect such a turn of events. The man continued to act as if he had said something stupid. Theo was never one to be shy, so he decided to rephrase his words. He invited Irene to spend the night alone with him. The girl began to cover her ears. She did not want to hear such words. It was very offensive to her. Irene asked her husband to stop and not to continue this conversation. In her thoughts, the girl scolded herself for her behavior. She had no right to shout at her master because she was just a servant. The difference between them could not be ignored, no matter how much Irene wanted to. That is why she tried to bury these feelings. The girl wished to remain a faithful servant of Mr. Evan, so as not to disturb Theo. Irene did not understand why Theo continued to pay attention to her. He took the girl's hands so that she would not hold her ears. The prince also asked why she behaved like that. He did not understand why Irene took his shirt and pressed it to her face. The man decided that he really likes her. The girl stood in silence, thinking about her answer. Irene couldn't hate the attention of the man she liked, but things didn't have to be that way. Theo's words drove the girl into a dead end. Theo openly admitted that he likes Irene. He tried to explain to the girl that people say such things when they feel sympathy, and there are no other reasons. Irene wanted to hear what it was that the prince liked about her. The man honestly answered that she had a beautiful face. It turned out that the man simply appreciated the girl's appearance, and for this reason decided to establish a close relationship with her. Irene wanted to hear some more reasons for sympathy, but it was impossible because Irene and Theo did not know each other very well. The girl remembered Theo wrapping her injured legs, but she wasn't sure if he did. Theo offered to learn more about each other because good looks were all he liked about Irene at the moment. The girl did not even think about such things. She also knew absolutely nothing about the man. Theo suggested that the girl consider his proposal. He thought that the talks were enough, and they would continue the next day. The maids already had new information that their head would become His Majesty's personal servant. In her heart, Irene wished to remain in her permanent place, namely, to be Mr. Evans' personal servant. Soon, Irene was already in Evans' office. The prince frankly said that he could not do anything. He tried to calm the girl down and explained that Theo is not particularly picky. The girl knew that Theo was interested in an intimate relationship, but she could not confess to Evan in any case. His Majesty's servants did not have many duties. Since he already had 2 servants, there was not much work for Irene. It was as if dawn had dawned on Irene. She could not understand why the prince needed her at all. It turned out only for one thing. The girl had only to come to terms with the situation that had developed. Irene began to perform her new job. She thoroughly cleaned Prince Theo's room. Suddenly, a man came up from behind and gently pressed his lips to the girl's ear. He wondered if Irene had already thought about their conversation. Morally, Irene was ready for the continuation of their conversation, but she could not have thought that it would happen so quickly. The prince again, without being shy, asked if the girl wanted to enter into an intimate relationship with him. Theo continued to press Irene because he understood everything. She liked the man. For this reason, she could not refuse him. The girl had no choice but to avoid answering. It was so hard for Irene to love such a person. Theo grabbed Irene's arm, then her neck, holding her tighter and tighter. Their lips were too close. Irene felt her husband's quickened breathing. It wasn't enough for their lips to meet in a passionate kiss. The girl wanted it so badly, but she could not afford it because she was afraid. Irene pushed her husband away from her. He seemed to be mocking her. It seemed to the girl that from the very beginning, the man was simply mocking her. She really regretted smelling Theo's shirt. After all, it all started with this. Irene would never have thought that resisting temptation would be so difficult. She was fully prepared to reject Theo next time. The girl was not entirely sure about this, but she promised herself that she would at least try. Irene did not cease to be surprised, because the man she liked directly offered an intimate relationship. The girl nervously went through the documents. Sorting through the documents, Irene noticed that it was written in the ancient language of Almukt. The girl was familiar with this language because she studied it when she was preparing to enter school. This language has long since ceased to be used. Irene decided to put these papers in another pile. The girl was sure that they would be burned. Irene thought about how she could divert the prince's attention away from her. The girl was sad because she thought that if this continued, her heart would simply stop. In the corridor, Irene met the maid, Thelma. They had not seen each other for quite some time. Thelma was serving the princess, so Irene asked how Her Majesty was doing. Irene had a great idea. She came to Princess Lauren, who was very happy to see the girl. Irene knew that Mr. Theo had left for a meeting 20 minutes ago. Considering the return time, she had 10 minutes to spare. The girl wanted to convince Lauren to take her back to work as her servant. There was fragrant tea on the table, but Irene was not into it. The princess asked how Irene was doing, because she knew that Evan was always busy. The lady had no idea that Irene was now Theo's servant. The girl decided to tell the princess about it. Lauren, hearing that Irene is now serving Theo, simply went wild. She did not understand why her brother did this. The girl admitted that His Majesty himself asked Evan for this, and he could not refuse his brother. Irene could not tell everything to the princess. She just said that she has a lot of problems right now. The girl frankly explained to the princess that she was asking for help. Lauren got up from her chair and was ready to go to her brother immediately. The lady was outraged by her brother's attitude towards such a kind and hard-working servant. Lauren couldn't just leave it at that. Irene did not want her brother and sister to fight over her. The girl did not expect such a quick reaction from the princess. She asked Lauren to stop and not go to Theo. The princess didn't even listen to Irene. In one moment, Lauren just flew into the office where her brother was. The lady demanded an immediate conversation. Irene stood quietly behind her, her eyes downcast. The girl could not think that her words would affect the princess so much. If Irene had only known that things would turn out like this, she would never have brought up the subject. Theo looked at the women and did not understand anything. The man was surprised by the fact that Irene was on the side of the princess, and not on his side. Lauren nervously asked her brother if he had made Irene his servant. The princess openly showed her displeasure. The lady demanded an explanation, justifying everything by the fact that the prince makes life difficult for the girl. The girl prayed that time would turn back. She didn't know how she would look into Theo's eyes now. Lauren openly said that Irene came to her for shelter. The lady continued to shout that she was not satisfied with her brother's behavior. Lauren demanded that Irene be returned to her. The man looked calm. He wasn't even nervous. Theo looked at the girl and asked what kind of problem she was worried about. The girl pulled herself together and forced herself to answer one single question. Irene said there was no problem. She scolded herself for today's mistake. It cannot be fixed. She regretted her action. Irene understood that the servants had no choice. Lauren, leaving the room, shouted that Theo should not think of offending the girl because she would be watching him closely. Finding herself alone with Theo, the girl felt awkward. The man wanted to know if being with him was such a big deal for Irene. The girl answered that not at all. The prince was clinging to Irene, and this bothered her. Theo understood what the problem was because the girl even went to see Lauren. He promised that he would never ask provocative questions again, and he would not pick on her. Theo apologized to Irene for everything he had done before. The words from his mouth sounded firm but sad. The man lowered his head and left the room. Servants who lost trust had no future. It was an obvious truth. There should always be trust in the relationship between master and servant. So it turned out that Irene slandered Theo in front of another person. Irene thought it would be better if Theo didn't pay attention to her in the first place. Before, he always greeted a girl. Later, everything changed. The man began to behave as if Irene did not exist. It was obviously Irene's fault. But the girl did not understand why Theo was behaving like this. He seemed to deliberately not notice her. Irene berated herself for asking Miss Lauren for help. While talking to the maid, she asked Irene if she knew the measurements of His Majesty Theo. They were needed to make a costume for Mrs. Lauren's birthday party. Irene was quite surprised, because His Majesty still had a suit from the Imperial Longevity Ceremony. The girl thought that he would be quite suitable. The maid explained that Theo had asked for a new suit to be made, because this one did not fit him. After thinking, Irene decided that it was necessary to sew a new suit, because soon there were to be many celebrations. The girl gathered her thoughts and decided to personally go to Theo. Being in front of the prince's door, Irene was a little nervous. Quickly knocking, she entered the office. Theo was sitting at the table, working with documents. The girl was holding a centimeter tape in her hands. Irene tried to explain to the prince that he needed to be measured. The man reluctantly put aside everything and stood in the middle of the room. The girl instantly, grabbing a centimeter, began to do her work. The young people's eyes met. Irene was tormented by various thoughts. She forced herself to stop thinking and dreaming about her husband. When the girl measured Theo's waist, they were very close to each other. When Irene finished, her heart was leaping out of her chest. The girl tried not to make any appearance. She said that she had finished, and very soon the husband would have a suit according to the new measurements. Irene was about to leave the room. She was so nervous that she did not look under her feet. The girl went crazy, but Theo caught her. Irene, lowering her head, thanked the prince. Her cheeks turned red with worry. The prince's assistant went into the office. He came with a report on the northern region. Basil looked intently at Irene. The girl was confused and asked permission to leave. Basil was still looking at Irene. He asked the prince if this was the same servant he had been talking about. The assistant asked the prince how long he had been interested in women. Theo denied everything, but Basil noticed Irene's face. He seemed to understand everything. The prince frankly did not like such a strange manner of communication of his assistant. Theo noticed that the man would start talking about something and then stop abruptly. This annoyed the prince very much. Basil came to tell about the successful development of the northern lands. Marquis Isaac actively contributed to this. Theo's presence was not mandatory, and the assistant said that in case of unforeseen situations, he would report everything. The servant wanted to pick up a stack of papers, and a letter flew out. The man's expression changed. He wondered why the prince had not yet responded to this letter. In Theo's opinion, the letter contained requests to win him over. It was not surprising, because the prince was quite popular. Basil wondered at Theo's behavior. The prince was very fond of praising himself. He did not lack self-confidence. Theo frankly did not understand the purpose of writing a large number of letters if they still meet at the service in the temple. The servant inquired about the contents of the letter. Theo handed the paper to the man, but the man did not know the language in which the letter was written. The prince did not understand the purpose of sending him a letter that no one could translate. Basil's father was a pastor, and he knew the language. But the father was no longer alive, so the letter remained unread. It's the day of Lauren's birthday party. Preparations for the holiday were in full swing. Everyone was busy. Work was boiling. The maids hustled to get everything done. Second Prince Theo's suit was ready. Irene examined the newly made clothes to see if they were in order. Strange thoughts again entered the girl's head. Despite everything, she tried to concentrate. Next to the prince were 3 servants who helped him get ready and his assistant. While Irene buttoned Theo's suit, a servant cleaned his shoes. Meanwhile, Basil was reading reports to the prince, so they saved time. Irene was glad that she and Theo were not alone this time. When the prince was completely ready, he interrupted the assistant and asked to finish the report later. Irene noticed that Theo was still not looking her in the eye. Basil tearfully begged Prince Theo to behave himself. The man assured that everything was fine and he was not going to arrange anything. Assistant Basil is His Majesty's closest subordinate. He was the one Mr. Theo could trust. Basil fussed, but asked the prince not to drink too much. Theo gave the assistant a stern look, saying that everything would be fine. The prince asked Basil to be quiet. Prince Theo planned to just say hello to everyone and leave. His eyes searched for his sister, Her Majesty Lauren. She should have been somewhere near the entrance. Since Theo had been absent from the palace for a long time, he had forgotten where his place was. Evan met Theo. Lauren, seeing Irene behind her brother, was very happy. The girl was also glad to meet them. Irene wished Lauren a happy birthday. They hugged sweetly. Princess Lauren did not expect to see her brother Theo on her birthday, as they were not on the best of terms. They had just met, and Evan already noticed that a fight was about to begin. The holiday has begun. A father with his 3 children began to walk along the red carpet of the corridor. Rose petals were thrown at Lauren, and she was loudly congratulated. The princess kindly waved at everyone. Lauren looked perfect, because it was her holiday. Theo, who did not have a warm relationship with his sister, considered her proud. Still, Theo and Lauren behaved better than Irene expected. The girl hoped that everything would continue as calmly. However, Lauren approached Theo and offered him a drink to celebrate the holiday. The princess did not look very friendly. Without hesitation, Theo agreed. The servants quickly set the small table. Lauren thought that just drinking would be boring, so she came up with what she thought was a brilliant idea. Theo assumed that his sister wanted to compete with him for the gift, but the man was wrong. Lauren wanted to compete for Irene. If the princess won, Irene had to become her servant again. The prince was surprised. He was intrigued by such a prize. The man could not even think that Irene needed his sister so much. Theo didn't want to give Irene away, but still accepted Lauren's offer. The prince noticed that Lauren really appreciated Irene. In Lauren's opinion, this girl deserved more. Irene was full of emotions. The girl never even thought that such a situation could happen to her. Irene wondered what the bet was for at all. The girl understood that she had no choice, and the winner would own her. She is an ordinary servant, whose words have no meaning. Theo gave his sister a stern look, but warned that if he won, Lauren would never bring up the subject again. The wine glasses became empty one by one. A cruel game has begun. After a while, there were many empty wine bottles around the table. The players did not give up. Irene asked the prince and princess to stop, because the young people had already drunk too much. It was as if no one had heard the girl. Theo was not going to give up. He didn't even think of giving it to Irene. Therefore, the man continued to pour himself a drink. Lauren didn't look too good from the large amount of alcohol. Later, Theo could barely stand on his feet. The bet was over because the players felt terrible. The maids helped them to their rooms. Theo was very dizzy, and the man could not even open his eyes. Irene wanted to ease the prince's suffering. It was her direct duty. The girl started stroking Theo's face. She was too much in love with him. It seemed to her that he hated her because she betrayed him. Irene wondered why the prince had not released her. The girl regretted her act because the prince did not talk to her anymore. She was so tired of it, but it was hard for her mentally. Theo continued to wreak havoc. According to Irene, it would be easier for her to hear that the prince hates her. The girl began to wake the prince, asking if he was still awake. The man was silent. He seemed to be in a deep sleep. Irene apologized to Theo, if only for this day. The girl could not hold back and gently kissed the prince. She completely relaxed and gave free rein to her feelings, which she could no longer hold back. Irene had no idea that Theo had opened his eyes. The man was surprised by such an act of the girl. Theo couldn't fathom what Irene was thinking. Not long ago, she herself pushed him away, preventing him from revealing his feelings. Theo wanted to know what Irene was doing. The man could not understand the reason for such a passionate kiss. The girl was convinced that the prince was asleep, but her act would remain a secret. Theo demanded an immediate explanation. He tried to extract from the girl the reason for her act, because she herself did not want an intimate relationship. The man looked angry because the girl was controlling his feelings. Under pressure from Theo, Irene admitted that she wanted him. The girl tried to hide her eyes. The prince did not understand the girl's logic and the reason why she pushed him away. But he saw that he cared about her. Theo wanted to kiss Irene immediately. The man explained that if she didn't like it, she could hit him or bite his tongue. The prince passionately kissed Irene, placing her on the sofa. Irene could not understand her feelings. It seems that she really fell in love with this man. It seemed impossible to her. She kissed her loved one for the first time. It was a very pleasant feeling. Theo began to caress Irene. She did not understand what was being done because she had never experienced anything like this. The girl could not breathe with pleasure. Everything was quite strange. Theo drank the wine, and Irene felt drunk. Theo convinced Irene that he was not doing it because he was drunk. His mind and consciousness were pure. The man whispered that he was not going to avoid responsibility. The girl admitted that she always wanted intimacy with Theo, but she could not say it directly. She felt shy. Theo promised to be gentle and attentive. The prince wanted Irene not to hide her face and breasts. He wanted to see the girl in all her beauty. This excited the man very much. The prince really liked the smell of Irene's body. Their hugs and kisses went further and further. That night, their bodies merged into one. Irene had never felt anything like it. The girl was overwhelmed with emotions. In the morning, Irene experienced severe lower back pain. The girl soberly assessed the situation. She even regretted what had happened, because he was a prince. Irene couldn't believe how it had occurred to her to reciprocate Theo. The man still wanted to sleep next to Irene. He pulled the girl by the hand, and she lay down next to him. In her mind, the girl scolded herself more and more. She did not want to believe in this reality. Irene thought that she had finally lost her mind because she had spent the night with the prince. It was not possible because she is an ordinary servant. Theo insisted that he acted consciously yesterday and understood the seriousness of the situation. The man hugged the girl tightly, but did not want to let go. Theo didn't see their relationship as a mistake. He was glad that Irene was completely his this night. Irene felt completely sleep-deprived, so she rubbed her red eyes. Theo said they would bring the clothes now. Irene did not believe what she heard, because the prince personally asked to bring clothes. Irene thought it was the end, and it was too bad. Everyone around will understand that Theo was with a servant. This situation depressed the girl very much, since gossip will not make itself wait. Irene believed that very soon everyone would find out about their relationship. The girl's arms and legs trembled. Her consciousness gave alarm signals. Theo was surprisingly calm. He offered Irene breakfast and kissed her. The man hinted that they could repeat everything that happened at night. The girl, covering herself with a blanket, said that they could not. Theo was very relaxed. His kisses on the neck brought great pleasure to the girl, but she gathered courage and pushed the prince away, arguing that her back hurt. Basil knocked on the door. Irene froze in anticipation. She didn't want anyone to see them together. The girl again regretted what had happened, but no one has yet managed to turn back time. Theo shouted for Basil not to enter yet. Irene wrapped herself in a blanket up to her ears. She was scared. After a while, an assistant came in and brought breakfast and clothes. Irene felt lousy. Breakfast was only for one person, although the prince asked for two. The girl noticed that Basil was in a bad mood. She assumed that he suspected something. Theo waved for Irene to have breakfast. Basil handed over the letter from the temple. This was not the first letter. It was written in a language that no one understood, so the prince thought it was meaningless. Irene had already seen a similar letter in the same black envelope, and then she sent it for disposal. People from the temple kept writing letters, so a response had to be given. Theo thought it was just bullying, because he didn't know the contents of the letter. Irene suggested that there might be important information there and said that she would be happy to translate. Theo couldn't believe that Irene knew the ancient language. The man was happy because these letters did not give him peace. Now he will finally understand everything and be able to give an answer. The events took place 10 years ago. The priest came to the emperor and told about the prophecy. It was absolutely true, and it meant that in exactly 10 years, Theo would meet death. It was irreversible. Theo handed the letter to Irene. Basil wondered if the girl had not graduated from the spiritual academy at some point. Irene denied everything, explaining that she was just preparing for admission there. The girl explained that she had circumstances that prevented her from entering the academy. Basil never ceased to wonder. He couldn't believe that an ordinary maid could speak an ancient language and was once going to enter the academy. Theo admitted that although he came from the royal family of Veronica, religion was not close to him at all. So far, absolutely all the high priest's prophecies have come true. 10 years ago, it was prophesied that Theo would die at the age of 23. The prince could not even convey all the suffering that his family experienced after learning about it. Theo was still alive, which was no small surprise. Irene, having translated the letter, looked at the men with surprise. Theo decided that his fate had changed. Since the prophecy about his death did not come true, the man expected a variety of reasons. The prince was surprised that he was still alive. He wondered why this happened. Basil suggested going to the temple. The initiation ceremony was in 3 days, and Theo was determined to go there. Theo, Basil, and Irene rejoiced that the prophecy had changed, but no one could even think of what the reason was. Irene was glad that she was able to translate the letter and was able to help in some way. The next morning, Evra wondered why Irene had not returned to the dormitory. The girl did not want to tell anything, so she carefully changed the subject. But Evra persistently asked. Irene explained that Prince Theo had had too much to drink and was sick. It was necessary to stay with him. Evra said that it was better not to tell the butler about it. Evra pointed her finger at her neck and said that Irene had a mark from a kiss on that spot. The girl was embarrassed, but came to the conclusion that she should be more careful with the prince. When Irene came to pour tea for Theo, he threw himself into her arms. The man gently kissed the girl's neck. His breathing became louder and faster. Theo asked where Irene's dress was for the ceremony that was soon to take place. The girl was going to leave in the usual clothes of a servant. The prince suggested that the girl take a day off. Dvoretsky could happily handle her work. Irene stood her ground and said she wanted to be at the ceremony to take care of Theo. The man chastised himself for delaying so long. Theo asked if the girl still had lower back pain. Irene was afraid that someone would hear, so she covered her husband's mouth with her hand. Theo asked Irene to take at least today off. The man did not stop kissing the girl. Irene smelled a very pleasant smell from the prince. It was the same smell of forget-me-nots. Theo's eyes were as blue as the petals of these flowers. Theo felt at ease around Irene. Finally, everything started to improve in his life. From the very beginning, it seemed to the prince that the girl was simply cautious, but one day he began to notice her gaze. Theo never understood why Irene looked at him with such a strange look. For a while, the man could resist, but everything came to a close relationship. Maybe that's why they became so closely related. The prince carefully took his beloved by the waist and pressed her to him. He gently kissed her juicy lips. It seemed to the man that every day he was getting more and more crazy about Irene. His Majesty Theo is the first man in the entire history of the Veronica Empire to change the prophecy of the temple. This is possible only thanks to a strong will and a huge risk. Theo's future was now impossible to predict. Irene and the other maids got into the carriage. During her entire life in the capital, the girl never left the palace. The girls were going to the temple. Their journey should last about an hour. The girl felt like in those times when she was in the palace for the first time. Prince Theo and Basil rode in another carriage. Theo decided that Basil was jealous of him because he objected to Irene riding in the carriage with them. Theo wanted to hear Basil's reason for thinking the girl shouldn't go with them. The assistant, lowering his eyes, muttered that his father was a priest. Basil's whole family was against their son becoming a knight. Basil explained that it was for this reason that, compared to ordinary people, he was quite good at theology. The man did not reject the idea that Irene could be a spy for the temple. Basil made a strong case. The reason was that an ordinary girl preparing to enter the academy could not learn the ancient language that well. Even Basil's father, having become a priest, did not know her. Basil was convinced that even after studying at the academy, he would not be able to read so fluently. Theo concluded that Irene simply seemed suspicious to her husband. The assistant also said that after Theo's fortunes changed, the church continued to send him letters. The prince thought about the man's words. He found it hard to believe that Irene could be a spy. The fact that Irene was closely watching Theo became clear to her husband. The prince still could not fully believe that this could be true, because the girl was not at all like a spy sent by the church. Even if the girl is a spy, it was still his Irene. The prince knew very well that it would be very difficult to convince Basil. The man was always very careful. Arriving at the destination, Irene saw the Holy Temple. It was the feast of saints of any theologian. The girl had never seen such beauty before. She wanted to examine everything in detail. Basil could not believe such a violent reaction of the girl. He thought she was bluffing. The man wanted to bring Irene to clean water as soon as possible. The high priest was informed that the imperial carriage had arrived, but the emperor himself did not appear in it. The priest admitted that the emperor wanted to hand over the throne. The priest was convinced that Prince Evan, who was the first child of the emperor, would take his place. His brother Theo also always supported Evan's candidacy. The priest knew well that the emperor never refused the requests of his beloved daughter Lauren. The minister of the church believed that his blessing was needed. A few minutes later, Evan, Theo, and Lauren were standing in front of the high priest. The man told the young people that he had been waiting for them for a long time. Theo considered the priest a powerful, arrogant old man. The beginning of the ceremony was announced. The priest blessed Theo. Irene watched the blessing process in fascination. She always wanted to devote herself to faith, but as soon as she saw the ceremony, her heart jumped. Irene understood that in order to reach the post of high priest, she must become such an incredible person like him. The second prince was now completely healthy. This is all thanks to the constant support of the church. The priest said that he was sending letters to Theo. The man smiled and said that he had read it just yesterday. The priest's face changed dramatically. Theo explained that he had found a person who had translated the ancient language, but it was not worth reading the letter, because it was specially written in an ancient language so that no one could understand it. Theo wanted to start the ceremony as soon as possible. The priest was upset, but decided that a new prediction should be obtained. All the people around listened attentively to the priest. Irene was glad that she would be able to see the miracle with her own eyes. Some insisted on going to the temple, but the priest said that it was not necessary. One could only assume that a change in the prophecy could lead to trouble. After some time, Theo was sitting in the office. The man was talking to Basil. The prince wondered if Basil was sometimes unaware of the high priest's true motives. The prince realized that the very fact of changing the prophecy was a huge blow to the authority of the church. That is why the letters were sent in an ancient language, so that no one could find out the truth. Before the initiation ceremony itself, the priest really wanted to talk to Theo alone. The prince was sure that the priest planned to change his prophecy in order to use this knowledge for personal purposes. The priest, using his power, tried to get a new prophecy. Pure white light appeared. Everything shone over the second Prince Theo. It was incredible. None of those present had seen this before. It was a divine revelation. After a while, the light disappeared. Only magical butterflies flew next to Theo. According to the priest, it was God who intervened in the fate of Mr. Theo. God saved his life. The Lord himself decided to change Theo's fate, although his majesty was blessed without it. The priest understood why his prayers had no effect at all. The light that shone around Theo confirmed that fact. People who were under the impression whispered. They saw with their own eyes how the prediction changed according to God's will. It was a miracle. It turned out that this man could change the whole world. The priest called Theo to him. He explained that God does not intervene in fate just like that. It turned out that Theo was something like his reincarnation. The priest was amazed because this had not happened for 1,000 years. The priest was very happy that such an important event happened during his reign. He did not want to miss his chance. Meanwhile, Prince Theo was looking at the amazing butterflies that circled around him. The servant of the Batten Temple called Irene to him. It seemed to the girl that the man looked like someone. Since Irene's back hurt, Theo asked the temple minister to heal her. Batten admitted that Basil was his brother. The man touched Irene's back, and her lower back pain disappeared. The girl was much relieved. Irene sincerely thanked her savior. Theo got down on one knee in front of Irene. This surprised the girl very much, because this was not the first time this had happened. The girl wondered why the prince was doing this. One thought did not give the girl peace. Theo was blessed by God himself. God himself changed the prediction. Oivchina saw this live for the first time. Since Irene had previously studied theology, she said it was simply incredible. Irene decided that Theo deserved God's blessing. The prince, looking at Irene, was sure that Basil had misunderstood everything. This cute creature just couldn't be a spy. Theo wanted Irene to come to his room at night. The girl asked the reason. Theo just smiled, but said that he didn't want to say such things out loud. The maids whispered about the divine blessing of His Majesty Theo. The girls enthusiastically talked about this topic. One of them said that among the knights there was a rumor that the Lord always blesses Veronica's heroes. Another girl did not believe in the gossip, but was sure that it was some kind of political trap. On an equal footing, the girls began to quarrel because their opinions differed. Irene came to Theo's room. The man was upset that he did not wait for his beloved at night. Irene could not come earlier because she was assigned the night shift. The man was sure that the girl had a small break. Theo invited Irene to come over that night. The prince was delighted with the girl's appearance from the very beginning. On the spur of the moment, they gave free rein to their feelings. Irene had previously been sure that His Majesty just wanted to play. Irene understood Theo's thoughts less and less every day. After the night spent together, the girl decided that she would not worry about it anymore. The difference in their statuses is a huge barrier, and this was an important fact. Irene was pouring tea for Theo and was so lost in thought that the drink was already spilling over the mug. In an instant, the kettle of hot tea fell to the floor. The girl was excited, but said that she would immediately clean everything up. She scolded herself for her thoughts. Theo gently leaned against Irene's arm. The man took her in his arms and carried her to the sofa. The girl wanted to clean up the wreckage as soon as possible before anyone got hurt. Theo told Irene to just sit. The man pulled out a first aid kit and began treating the girl's injured leg. Irene plunged into memories. Everything was exactly as before. Theo noticed that the girl was deep in a dream. Irene asked the prince for help, deciding that she was only a hindrance to him and did not bring any benefit. The girl is the head of the servants, and lately she has been constantly making mistakes. Irene was certain that His Majesty was not taking her seriously. Theo immediately denied all the girl's words, because she was doing many important things. Theo did not understand why Irene was punishing herself so much, because she coped perfectly with her duties. For the prince, Irene was very valuable. He did not want her to scold herself for something. Theo continued to tell how important Irene is to them, and how much she does. The man convinced that thanks to the girl his life became much easier. To Irene, these were just words that had no meaning. A servant must not make mistakes, which Irene could not say about herself. This fact was known to everyone without exception. Irene realized that because of her mistakes, Theo continued to say nice words, worry, and comfort her. The man was saying what she always wanted to hear. Theo put Irene on the bed. He wanted something more. Theo asked to be called only by his first name. Irene refused. Theo pressed her even tighter, but said that in that case they would spend the whole night here. It was difficult for Irene, because she had never addressed the prince by his first name before. The minister of the temple met with Monet. He wanted to convey something to her. The lady said that she will definitely be in the temple at dawn. Monet was sure that this did not bode well for Captain Theo. In the morning, Irene came to Theo's office as usual. The girl saw in front of her a young lady whom she had never seen before. Irene brought the documents that Theo asked her for. Prince Theo asked Monet how the task went. According to intelligence, the marauders captured the northern pass of Mount Carmel. The negotiations did not go well, so we had to deal with it in a different way. The lady said that several holy artifacts were stolen, which will soon be returned to the palace. and on the way back, the woman was contacted by the church where she was going. Theo was surprised. The church minister reported that Theo was marked with the sign of the apocalypse, and the church was looking for an avatar for a man. The sign of the apocalypse is a rare phenomenon to which only the blessed of the Lord are prone. In order to receive the full divine blessing, an intermediary between Theo and God was needed, the avatar. The human was to become Prince Theo's avatar. Anyone who spoke with the Blessed One could become an avatar, that is, whoever spoke with Theo. The woman herself did not fully understand everything, but she was informed that this was the main condition. And now they contacted everyone who knew Theo. Avatar has already been selected. No one knew who was chosen. Theo did not understand why he was called to the temple because it was a waste of time. Monet explained that she knew nothing about religion and therefore did not delve into the details. It seemed to her that this was a huge concern for them. Irene could not believe that the avatar had already been found. It was like God coming down to earth. Such an event could change the course of history. Theo couldn't understand the real reason he was summoned. The lady was more than sure that the priest planned to reveal the identity of the avatar on the day of Theo's birth. The prince had a bad feeling. After thinking about everything that was said, Irene assumed that the avatar is a very close person for Theo. The prince did not want to engage in his opinion, nonsense. He asked to convey that the servants of the temple should take care of it themselves because it would make him sneeze. Monet left the office. Irene also wanted to leave, but Theo held her back. He offered the girl to rest because she was constantly running somewhere and in a hurry. Irene still had a lot of work ahead of her. The girl was surprised that Theo did not care and was not at all interested in information about the avatar. If she were him, she would have been looking for some information a long time ago. Theo replied that he did not have time for such activities. The man explained that he had a lot of trouble without it. Theo asked to talk to him a little because filling out the documents is quite boring. Irene thought that, on the contrary, she would disturb Theo with her chatter. Irene decided to tell that her family has 5 children. Mother was always busy, so Irene took care of her brothers and sisters herself. The girl had a lot of experience in household chores, so she became a servant. Theo inquired about the girl's father. It turned out that he died when the girl was still small. The husband died on the battlefield during the war, and the mother worked as a maid for an Oriental writer. Once the mother told her daughter that the imperial palace was hiring servants, and before leaving she gave her homemade shoes. But Irene had few reasons to wear them. The girl said that she is in constant contact with her family. Theo asked how her relatives were doing. Irene's salary was sufficient, so the girl financially supported the family. She had nothing to complain about. Theo considered Irene to be a very strong and generous girl because she gave part of her money to the family. The prince understood why Irene was preparing to enter the academy, but was never able to study there. A very young girl took on a huge responsibility for her family. She spent a lot of time with her brothers and sisters, so there was no time for herself at all. Theo was convinced that he was completely right, not Basil. A girl like Irene will never cheat. The assistant fantasized too much about the innocent girl. Basil came to Theo's office. He wanted to tell the prince about the avatar, but he already knew everything. The assistant handed the prince papers containing information about Irene. Reading the documentation, Theo decided that there was nothing special there as he had thought. Basil was convinced that there was no reason to worry about Irene being involved in espionage. Theo, putting the documents on the table, said that Irene must prove that she is not a spy. This was the prince's demand. The man asked to deal with it quietly, so that Irene would not find out anything. Theo planned to introduce Irene at his birthday celebration at the temple. Basil was adamantly against it, on the grounds that it would be no ordinary ceremony. Theo understood that the church wanted their man to gain his trust. Theo is a prince who received a divine blessing. It was obvious that the church wanted to build a connection with Theo through the avatar. The prince thanked God that Basil was on his side. Theo was also convinced that they did not need such connections. The prince wondered if Basil had spoken to Monet. The assistant, blushing, said that she had just heard gossip. Basil had long been in love with Monet, but this love was not mutual. Theo tried to explain to the man that reckless actions are bad. Basil smiled slyly, because Theo was no different from him. Theo wanted to know if Basil had already introduced Irene to Monet. The man, lowering his eyes, was silent. Theo wanted to believe in Irene's innocence, but he had to be sure. Irene began to hem Theo's suit. Suddenly, Monet, who was looking for records about the undeveloped northern lands, entered the room. The prince was not in the room, and Irene herself handed over the documents to the lady. Monet said that Basil had mentioned Irene in letters. The girl could not understand what was being said. Monet introduced herself and said she was Theo's assistant. The girls saw each other once, but there was no time to get to know each other. Monet said that Basil writes letters to her from time to time. In one of the letters, the man mentioned the name Irene, but there was nothing special. Monet directly asked if Irene and His Majesty Theo were in a relationship. The girl was shocked by Monet's awareness. She could not have imagined that gossip would spread so quickly. The lady assured that she was not going to tell anyone about it. Irene lowered her eyes and took a deep breath. Monet smiled and wished the young people a happy future. It dawned on Irene that Basil had known about it for a long time as well. The girl had no idea that anyone even knew about it. Irene understood that it would not be very good if the gossip spread, because problems could appear both for her and for His Majesty. Monet thought Basil was blind, because he didn't tell Irene that Irene was a pretty and sweet girl. The lady was not at all surprised that the prince fell in love with her. It's Theo's birthday. Irene helped her husband to pack. The ceremony was about to begin, and it was necessary to hurry. The prince said that the worries should be resolved as soon as possible. Irene did not understand what was being said. It was noisy in the palace that day. The emperor thanked the guest for coming to congratulate his son on his birthday. The emperor was about to make a statement. His Majesty said that Theo had received God's blessing. Only divine incarnation can reveal the full essence of his blessing. The emperor invited a woman to the hall, who was accompanied by 3 servants. The woman was dressed in a white dress and was quite beautiful. The guests began whispering, guessing that it was the Avatar. The woman bowed to the emperor and was quite kind. Theo was very surprised that his avatar was not a man. Monet knew that it was a woman, but kept silent. So it was a complete surprise to Theo. The woman was the embodiment of divine blessing. The prince felt that he was having more and more problems. The emperor invited the woman to come closer. She bowed to him and said that it was a great honor for her to speak with the emperor. The woman's name was Sonia Dale. There was noise in the hall again. People suspected that she was the daughter of Jason Dale himself. His Majesty the Emperor wished the woman a nice evening. Lauren was angry because the birthday had been turned into a wedding. The princess thought that a white dress was inappropriate at this moment. Theo asked his sister not to talk nonsense. Evan, tapping his brother on the shoulders, asked him not to frown because it was his birthday. Lauren was not in the mood because Evan congratulated Theo and didn't even send her a birthday card. Evan joked that everyone had already congratulated Lauren, but no one had time to congratulate Theo because he has a difficult character and everyone is afraid of him. Lauren babbled that even Irene couldn't stand Theo. The princess didn't even know how wrong she was. Evan said goodbye, saying he had a lot to do. Lauren, who was watching Sonia, thought that everyone was worried about this woman only. Everyone wanted to look beautiful on holidays. Such a bright personality has not appeared in the palace for a long time. The Avatar had not been in the palace for 1,000 years. Theo asked that Basil bring the people with whom he was scheduled to meet. Sonia congratulated Theo. The woman said that she came to meet, but there was no opportunity to even introduce herself. It seems that Theo was not happy with the new acquaintance. Moreover, there was a lover next to him. The Avatar explained that they would see each other more often in the future. Theo spoke to the woman rather harshly and indifferently. The prince asked Irene to bring urgent documents because they needed to be dealt with immediately. Sonia realized that her husband simply did not want to talk to her. She did not know the reason. Irene turned and saw Sonia's gaze. He was like she herself once was. The woman seemed upset because the man she came to was avoiding her. His Majesty Theo tugged at the brooch, but almost tore it off. The man was not feeling well, so he wanted to unbutton his shirt. Theo thanked Irene for playing along with him so skillfully. Theo didn't understand what everyone needed from him all the time. The man was often disturbed, and this made him very tired. Theo was part of the ruling family and needed to keep his face in public. Irene asked Theo to raise his hands. The man needed help to change into more comfortable clothes. The prince grabbed the girl by the neck and passionately pressed her to him. Theo wanted to hear a word of greeting from his beloved. The girl felt embarrassed and blushed. Irene was choosing her words awkwardly. Still, she was able to congratulate her husband. Theo brought up Irene's work again. He believed that the girl worked too much, even more than he himself, and the man so wanted to spend more time with her. Irene smiled and said that it was her duty. Working as a maid was not easy, but the girl was already used to it, and the salary motivated her. Theo wanted to get closer to Irene as soon as possible. The man began to unbutton the girl's shirt. He lowered Irene's outer garment and exposed her shoulders. The man also asked for permission to kiss his beloved. It was a surprise to Irene, because Prince Theo had never asked permission for such a thing. The man said that if he refused, he would stop. Irene whispered that she craved Theo's kisses. The girl once again congratulated her husband on his birthday, and they began to kiss passionately. Theo asked Irene not to be shy and stick her tongue out, because it's much more pleasant that way. Soon, the young people found themselves on the bed. It seems that Irene was jealous of Theo for one woman. It was Avatar. During the kisses, the girl stopped and asked Theo if he knew Sonia well. It was quite inappropriate for such a romantic situation. The conditions for receiving a blessing from the Avatar, judging by the words of Monet, had some catch. These thoughts disturbed Irene. The man immediately got up. The prince decided that Irene was thinking about the woman because she had to bless him. Theo claimed that he found out who the Avatar was when Irene did. The girl thought Sonia was beautiful, and it made her uncomfortable just thinking that the woman and Theo would spend time together. The romantic atmosphere seemed to be blown away by the wind. Irene got up and started buttoning her shirt. The girl wanted to leave as soon as possible, citing the fact that she had a lot of work. Theo could not hold back, but pressed Irene against the wall, saying that he only needed her. The man sealed his persuasive words with a kiss. The young people woke up together for the second time. They had a great night enjoying each other. Theo looked at Irene, who was sleeping soundly and sweetly. The girl looked so calm and relaxed. The prince looked at the girl's features with a smile. He was drawn to her more and more every day. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. It was Basil. As soon as the man started to say something to Theo, he quickly pushed him out the door. In a moment, the men were standing in front of the door of the room. Theo nodded his head to Basil, but was ready to listen to him. The assistant realized that the maid Irene was there again. The man did not pretend that he did not know anything, but asked about it out loud. Theo acted as if he hadn't heard the question. Basil informed the prince that His Majesty the Emperor wished to see him. The prince was surprised, because Basil insisted on leaving immediately. Theo thought it was too early an hour. The man had no idea what the urgency was. The prince planned to rest at least this day, but all his plans went awry. Basil took out his watch and hurried the prince, because there was not much time left. Theo asked to be given a few minutes to change his clothes. He also asked Basil to bring a change of clothes for Irene. The butler bowed to Prince Theo, but was very glad to see him. The man went to his father, who was waiting for him in the garden. Theo's opinions were varied. He wanted to know the reason for such an early meeting as soon as possible. Theo came closer to his father and bowed to him. The emperor invited his son to sit down and drink hot tea. The prince was sure that his father called him for a reason unrelated to the army. The emperor said that he had certain information from the words of the servants. Usually Theo was already awake at this time and going to training. The prince understood what his father was hinting at. The man assumed that Basil had told everything to his father. Theo was tense, so he drank his tea sip by sip. The prince noticed that the tea made by Irene was much tastier. After drinking the mug to the last drop, the man was in the mood for a conversation. The emperor inquired what Theo thought of the banquet held in honor of his birthday. The man said that everything was as usual. There was just more booze, people, and music. The emperor spoke about Sonia, who was at the celebration. Theo listened carefully to his father. The emperor explained that this woman was chosen by God, so they should call her saint. His Majesty considered her a modest and sweet girl. Theo believed that it was normal for this woman to be like this, since she was the reincarnation of their deity. A few days before, the emperor had talked with people from the temple, who had one proposal for him. The emperor intended to marry Theo and Sonia. The prince seemed to be glued to the chair. He did not expect such a turn of events, because he already had a girlfriend to whom he was not indifferent. The emperor believed that this marriage was very important for the empire, because thanks to it, the imperial family and the temple would be able to conclude a centuries-long union. Theo interrupted his father because he thought that he was talking nonsense. Theo didn't want to continue listening to his father. The emperor tried to convince his son that this marriage was not only for the sake of the union, but also because, as a father, he was grateful to the temple for saving his son's life. The emperor believed that this marriage was an ideal opportunity to express recognition. His Majesty insisted that his son consider his words very carefully. But Theo did not seem to listen to his father. The man got up from the table and began to leave, exclaiming that he had already made up his mind and was not going to get married. The prince believed that his father could simply pour gold generously as a sign of gratitude. It turned out that the father wanted to use his son in a political marriage, pretending that he meant something to him. Theo was very indignant and depressed. Basil tried to catch up with Theo. The man thought that it was not worth responding so sharply to his Majesty. The prince became even more angry. Theo started yelling at Basil that he was wrong. The prince did not want to fall at the emperor's feet and agree to a wedding with Saint. The assistant tried to say something, but Theo abruptly stopped him because he did not want to listen to anything. Theo had his own opinion. He believed that marriage should be concluded for love and not for political reasons. The prince got into the carriage and ordered to leave immediately. He was not ready for this marriage. Meanwhile, Irene woke up. She noticed that Theo was not in the room. The girl went to put her clothes in order. To begin with, she needed at least something to wear. It turned out to be the prince's things. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Irene's heart almost jumped out of her chest. The servant opened the door to the room. Irene, not thinking of anything better, decided to hide behind the sofa. When the man entered the room, he did not see anyone. Irene recognized Raoul by his voice. The girl understood that she should sit quietly, because if she catches the eyes of this man, gossip will spread very quickly. Irene prayed that the man would leave the room as soon as possible. Raoul bent down and picked up Irene's dress. The girl thought that this was the end. The man heard a sound under the bed. He thought they were mice. Raoul wanted to look under the bed and already knelt down. Irene's heart was beating wildly. The girl covered her mouth with her hand, trembling with fear. But at that moment, Theo entered the room. Irene exhaled. The prince was unhappy that Raoul was rummaging under his bed. The man smiled and said that he had brought the maid's uniform, as he had been asked to do. The man kindly said as he placed the form on the table. He asked permission to leave. Theo noticed Irene sticking her head out from under the bed. When Raoul left, Irene finally calmly got out of hiding. The girl didn't want unnecessary gossip and looks in her direction, so she was glad that Raoul didn't notice her. The prince noticed that the girl had injured her leg. She got under the bed so quickly that she didn't notice the blood. Theo suggested treating the wound with a healing salve to keep the inflammation at bay. Irene said that everything was fine because she did not want to cause the prince extra trouble. Theo insisted because there was also a bruise on his leg. The girl was pleased that her husband was worried about her and wanted to help. Theo noticed that Irene was in a good mood, and it seemed to him that the girl's wound really did not hurt. The man did not listen to his beloved, but still took out the ointment and treated the wound. He asked Irene to protect herself. Irene learned more and more about Theo. At first, the prince seemed to the girl to be a rude and unpleasant man, but the more she talked with him, the more she became convinced that he was actually kind and good. Irene asked Theo why she didn't see him when she pretended. Theo did not want to go into details, but simply said that his father wanted to see him. Theo's expression changed. The girl thanked the prince for his concern. She really wanted to know what had happened, but she was convinced that the man would not discuss his affairs with the maid. When Irene thought about this, she was very worried about the difference in their statuses. Theo hugged the girl and hinted that she was wearing his clothes. Irene had already forgotten that she had to change. Theo was about to leave because he had work to do. He asked Irene to get dressed and follow him out carefully. The man went out the door, and he felt sad, realizing that his father would continue to insist on marrying Sonia. Irene, going out into the corridor, met Raoul, who was going to clean His Majesty's room. The girl said that she was just from there. She tried to behave more naturally. Raoul whispered quietly that he heard noises in Theo's room. The man was sure that these were mice. Irene just smiled, knowing that she was the mouse. Raoul said that the maid Thelma was talking about some news. The man wanted to find out gossip about Irene. Unfortunately, the girl did not know anything. Both Thelma and Raoul loved to gossip. Irene was not like that at all. The girl devoted herself completely to her work, so she was not interested in nonsense. Thelma ran into the room where Irene was. The girl started talking about Prince Theo. She wanted to get all the information out as soon as possible. According to Thelma, Sonia Dale, whom everyone saw in the banquet hall, was going to marry Prince Theo. It was the first time Irene had heard of such a thing. This explained that His Majesty had a meeting with the high priest. Thelma was convinced of her words. She believed that the woman was very close to the prince and saw with her own eyes how well they got along with each other. Irene tried not to think about the bad, but the thought of how beautiful young people looked together did not leave Irene and hurt. Another maid, Evra, came up to them and said that His Majesty wanted to see Thelma. The maid was surprised and went to the prince. Evra somehow looked at Irene strangely. She had known about her relationship with Theo for a long time and asked the girl to be more careful so that the secret of the young people did not become known to everyone. Evra asked not to be seen by the other servants. The girl confirmed Thelma's words because she considered the gossip about Theo's marriage to be true. Evra was worried about Irene, but did not want the girl to have problems. Evra warned that such a romance could end badly because she and the prince were on completely different levels. Irene knew that she should not show her feelings to others. It was enough for the girl that Evra was ready to listen to her at any moment. To feel the support of a loved one was priceless. Evra offered to stay away from His Majesty, as he was going to marry and be with another woman. Evra convinced that even if Irene has a special relationship with Theo, the connection with him will only harm her. Evra shared her feelings with Irene, but she begged her to stop everything and go on her way. Irene was hurt. She convinced herself that under such circumstances it was necessary to keep a distance. Irene concluded that Sonia likes Theo. The girl even allowed the idea that they would be happy after getting engaged. All Irene could do was wish them happiness. Irene brought Theo the documents he requested. The man offered to stay because the meeting was almost over. Irene's conscience told her not to give up, but to surrender and give free rein to her feelings. But the girl's mind told her to refuse. Irene said she had other things to do and was about to leave. She wished the prince a good rest. Theo didn't want to just let the girl go, but she insisted. The man took Irene's hand, but did not want to let go. He wanted to spend time with the girl, but Irene pushed him away and asked her to let her go, saying she just wanted to leave. Theo saw from the girl's behavior that she was hiding something. He decided that something had happened. Irene's eyes seemed to be filled with tears, but the girl tried not to look into her husband's eyes. The prince decided to let Irene go, although his heart was restless. The whole situation was watched by Basil and Monet, who muttered that Theo must have been abandoned. The prince ordered everyone to be silent and not to meddle in other people's business. The prince explained that Irene was simply tired of all the worries, so he let her go. The man was convinced that the next day everything would be completely different. On the second day, Irene convinced Theo that she had a huge pile of things to do. And after 2 days, the girl said that she has critical days. Day after day passed like this, and each time Irene had different excuses. Irene herself was already tired of playing hide-and-seek with Theo because there was no other way to call it. It was difficult for the girl to meet her husband's gaze. Theo concluded that Irene resented him for something. Irene dismissed Theo's thoughts, saying that everything was fine. The man could not understand what was happening with the girl's behavior these days because she was avoiding him. Irene suddenly told Theo that she wanted to end the relationship with him. The man immediately guessed that it was gossip. Irene objected. The prince decided not to torture the girl, but said that she could go. Irene's heart was beating wildly. The girl praised herself for being able to break off the relationship. She would never do this voluntarily because she was so good with the prince. After Irene left, Theo sat still for a long time, lost in his thoughts. The girl seemed to feel better, but tears appeared in her eyes, and her heart sank into a coma. Irene understood that one should not cry because of such nonsense, but she could not control her emotions and cried bitterly. Irene, after thinking it over, went to ask for another job. The gentleman to whom the girl came was surprised, because Irene had recently changed her duties on behalf of His Majesty Theo. Irene asked the master to consider her request, although it was possible only because of good reasons. Mr. assumed that the girl was given such work with difficulty, but he was convinced that the girl had no problems with this work. Mr. promised to consider Irene's words and asked him to return to his permanent job for the time being. The girl did everything possible. All that remained was to survive the farewell ceremony with the Empress. The prince spoke to Basil and asked if the man had read his instructions. Basil said that he had read everything and came to the conclusion that there was no gossip going around the castle. Basil had only heard that Theo's servants had a good reputation and that the man knew how to find good people. Much to Theo's surprise, no gossip was discovered. The prince was convinced that it was because of them that Irene ran away from him. Lately, whenever the young people met, Irene ignored Theo. It seemed to the prince that he was losing his mind because he could not even find out why the girl had such tearful eyes. Basil listened to Theo in silence, but wondered what nonsense the prince was thinking. In fact, there were rumors of Theo and the Avatar getting married. Perhaps they will be false, and someone said it on purpose. Basil hesitated whether he should inform His Majesty of this. The prince looked intently into the man's eyes. He definitely saw that the assistant was hiding something from him. Basil chose to remain silent. The man lowered his head desperately. Basil felt that Irene had done the right thing by ending the relationship first, even though it seemed strange. Basil mumbled that Theo might have fed up with Irene. The prince did not believe this nonsense. Only he knew how good they were together. The man was indignant at such frankly impudent behavior of Basil and decided to remove him from his position. The assistant regretted what he had said, but it was impossible to turn back the time. The man wanted the best because the emperor was determined to marry his son. The morning has come. Irene sat motionless and looked out the window. She didn't want this day to ever come. The farewell ceremony was supposed to be in the temple. The prince knew that there would be many ears around, so he ordered everyone not to say anything unnecessary. The morning had just begun, and Irene already wanted it to end as soon as possible. Sonia was standing next to the priest. The emperor gladly greeted them. Only Theo did not like the presence of a woman. As it turned out, Sonia herself wanted to be present. The emperor declared that they were all very happy that the empress would once again be in the arms of God. Theo muttered that his late mother would have been happy about that too. Evan asked his brother to behave himself. Theo said indignantly that even on the day of his mother's funeral, he had to be here. The emperor tried to explain that Theo was having a very rough day, so his behavior could have been better. Sonia said that she would be happy to commemorate the empress with Theo. Everyone was invited inside, but the entrance was closed to Irene. The servant of the church explained that no one else could go to the farewell ceremony. Also, the man politely asked the girl to wait in another place. Irene decided that this was a sign from heaven that confirmed and indicated that she should not approach Theo and be with him. Irene met Batin, who was delighted at their unexpected meeting. The man understood that His Majesty was at the farewell ceremony, and Irene had no choice but to walk in the garden. The girl asked if there was a special place where she could be alone. Irene was told that the ceremony would take over an hour, and she planned to pray during that time. The girl wanted to calm her soul. Batten happily agreed to show Irene such a place. The guy led Irene to a beautiful building. He said that everyone can come here. Batten offered Irene to settle down and be alone with God. Irene began to pray for His Majesty Theo. The girl wished him mental and physical health. Irene had no idea that she was not alone. The coin was waiting at the entrance. She was bored and her whole body ached. The woman was not very religious, so she wondered what she could do here. Monet approached the building where Irene was at that moment. Looking inside, Monet was amazed. White wings shone on the back of Irene, who was praying. Everything around the girl was enveloped in magical light. Someone from behind put a hand on Monet's shoulder. The woman did not want anyone to see such a miracle. She pushed her husband out the door. Meanwhile, Irene was praying, and the guy who was behind her kindly greeted her. He watched the girl in fascination. Irene saw that a guy was watching her. He apologized and wanted to meet. Irene saw him for the first time. The young man looked special. His clothes were made of expensive fabric, and he also wore unusual jewelry. The guy came closer to Irene and introduced himself. His name was Hales Tilfod. The young man came from one of the families of the Marquises of the Veronica Empire. He became Marquis and head of the family when his predecessor died suddenly. Irene kindly said her name. The girl also said that she serves the imperial palace. Since the farewell ceremony for the empress was taking place on this day, the girl rode behind the carriage of the imperial family. The young man extended his hand to Irene and offered to walk and talk. The girl could not understand for what reason such an honor fell to her. Mainly, they did not pay much attention to the maids. Young people were walking in the forest. The girl could not even imagine what the topic of their conversation would be. Irene felt intrigued because they had moved a little far from the temple. The girl tripped over dry tree branches and almost fell. The guy caught her in an instant. The young man saw good manners in Irene, and she herself behaved with restraint and kindness. Hales wondered if Irene would be staying until the end of the ceremony. The girl asked to speak to her in your own voice because she felt uncomfortable. The young man initially refused, but then agreed so as not to upset the girl. Hales suddenly decided to say goodbye. Irene wondered if they would ever see each other again. The young man could not promise anything, but he said that he knew something. The guy said that Irene worries about too many things. Irene realized that Hales had heard her prayer, and she became very uncomfortable. The young man promised that he would not tell anyone her secrets. Hales confidently said that faith does not fade just because a girl opens her heart. He also said that when he has problems, he comes to the temple. The boy came here to calm his mind. The guy thought that he was lucky to meet such a nice girl. He also said that he will be in the capital for several days. Rumor has it that many find their avatars in the temple. Hales mentioned Sonia Dale. He wondered if the woman had really prayed for 2 years to heal His Majesty's wounds while he was fighting on the battlefield. No matter how much the man thought, it was strange to him. It was possible to receive the blessing of the divine avatar only by talking to him. Hales was sure that Sonia was clearly not the only one Theo had been talking to. The priest, for some unknown reason, found this woman too quickly. To Hales, Sonia looked very impatient. It seemed that the priest was becoming stronger at the expense of the avatar. Hales even talked to the avatar and watched her from afar. It seemed to the boy that Sonia looked like an ordinary aristocrat, but by no means a deity, although now she was called the divine avatar. Everything was much more interesting than Hales could have imagined. What Hales saw in the temple proved nothing, but the boy trusted his inner voice. He decided not to miss the opportunity to meet Irene once again. The girl had no idea why Hales unobtrusively insisted on meeting. She liked this man, so she didn't mind. Suddenly, His Majesty Theo was at Irene's side. He was surprised, but grabbed the girl by the shoulders because he did not expect her to talk to some guy. Theo became jealous because his feelings did not go away. The man had no idea what the 2 young people were doing in the forest. They didn't even know each other until that moment. Theo gently took Irene's hands to show that the girl belonged to him. Hales assumed that the farewell ceremony was already over. The young man bowed to His Majesty and kindly greeted him. Theo was worried why Irene was in the forest and not near the temple. As it turned out, the ceremony was still going on, but Theo was getting stuffy in the temple, so he decided to take a walk. The man stubbornly wondered what Irene had forgotten in the forest. The girl said that she wanted to pray, and she and Marquis Tilfod started a conversation. Theo was maddened with jealousy, but behaved rather proudly and arrogantly towards the young man, without even hiding it. It occurred to Hales that Theo had feelings for Irene. He noticed how the prince was worried about the girl. Irene said she had to go and said goodbye to Hales. The young man stared at them for a long time. He was glad that he had the opportunity to talk with such a good girl and wished to meet her again as soon as possible. To the girl's great surprise, the prince only pretended that they were getting back together. In fact, he just wanted to take Irene away from the Marquis, not wanting them to talk. Theo nervously walked a few steps faster than Irene. Then he grabbed the girl by the waist and angrily asked who this guy was. Irene had no idea where the young man came from and what his motives were. Confused, the girl said that she only knew his name. Theo raised his voice at Irene. He was almost screaming. It did not occur to Theo that the girl who belonged to him was quietly walking next to some young man. Irene did not understand the reason for her husband's anger. The girl guessed what had happened because she had been denying him intimacy for some time. Irene had very good reasons for this. According to the girl, Prince Theo was exaggerating everything too much. She and the Marquis had an ordinary conversation, which did not entail anything more. Irene, lowering her head, said that Theo could not worry about her because he had a bride. Irene started to cry. She accused the prince of playing with her because he knew about her feelings. The girl continued to cry, but said that the prince was just taking advantage of her for comfort. The girl continued to accuse the prince of his heartlessness. She tried to throw Theo out of her heart, but she couldn't. Theo lifted Irene's head and, looking into her eyes, said that he had never lied to her. He even swore it to her. The man finally understood the reason why Irene was running away from him. False gossip made the girl believe that the prince would marry the avatar, but it was far from the case. The man decided on his chosen one a long time ago, and it was definitely not Sonia. Irene, not having a frank conversation with the prince, decided that it was true. The girl had no idea that Theo refused to marry. The prince, realizing that he did not want to lose his beloved, began to passionately kiss her neck. He pressed the girl against the wall and kissed her everywhere he could. Irene was worried that someone might notice them, but there was no one around, and everything was fine with the prince, because he was glad that finally all the cards were revealed and he could enjoy Irene again. Theo continued to say that he did not need Sonia, and he had no intention of marrying her. The man explained that he immediately refused to marry, although the emperor insisted on his way. Irene understood that her husband was honest with her, but he did not deceive her. The girl felt ashamed because she ignored him for no reason. Theo was outraged by the gossip that spread around the palace. The man was sure that no one but his father could spread such gossip. He seriously intended to investigate this case, which almost ruined his life. The man was glad that all the misunderstandings were cleared up. Irene apologized for the fact that she made the prince worry, because the man could not find a place for himself from his worries. Irene was aware that she was an ordinary servant, and there was a huge barrier between her and Theo. The prince explained to the girl that he had not treated her as a servant for a long time. The man, hugging his beloved, said that he could not live without her. The prince continued to hold Irene tightly by the waist, but did not want this moment to ever end. The girl could never have imagined that one day she would hear a confession of love from His Majesty the Prince. Even so, Irene kept thinking about the difference between their statuses, but she still wanted to be happy with her loved one. Meanwhile, the priest shouted indignantly at Sonia. He was angry that the woman could not make Theo fall in love with her and called her useless. The avatar tried to explain that he could not control His Majesty's feelings. The priest did not want to listen to anything, but believed that she should do everything as he ordered. The man calmed down, but reminded Sonia that she herself told how she loved His Majesty with all her soul. For that reason, the priest made the girl a divine gift to Theo. The priest said that such a chance is not given to everyone, and he convincingly asked to take advantage of it. The girl needed to figure out how to win Theo's heart. Meanwhile, Hales was thinking about Irene. He saw that the relationship between the maid and the prince was ambiguous. It was more like a quarrel between lovers. Also, Prince Theo was too alarmed by his outing with Irene. The young man thought about how he could use this news, because it was clearly a secret of a couple in love. Happy Irene brought the prince breakfast. The man, as usual, asked her to stay with him. But Irene had a lot of work. She promised to be released sooner this time. The prince pressed Irene tightly to him and kissed her all over the face. The man admitted that his heart beats faster when he is near the girl. Theo took Irene's hand and held it to his chest. The girl really felt the prince's heart beating very fast. The man could not hold back again, but began to kiss his beloved. He was filled with incredible feelings that were difficult to convey in words. Monet, who, hearing the voices of young people, did not dare to enter Theo's office. The woman recalled the events that took place on the territory of the temple. Now, she was more than sure that Irene was the true divine avatar of Theo. Irene took the box and a long stack of papers. It was difficult for the girl, but she was sure that she would be able to deliver it on her own. She thanked her colleague for helping her sort through the documents. Monet was present in the palace and met with Basil. The man noticed Irene and understood that she had reconciled with His Majesty. Maybe it was for the best, because Theo immediately stopped being angry with Basil. Basil had long believed that there was something fishy about the relationship between Irene and His Majesty. But since he had no evidence, he had nothing to complain about. Monet believed that it was necessary to find out about everything. Irene, who took too many documents, saw little in front of her. Unexpectedly, she collided with someone, and all the documents scattered on the floor. The girl saw in front of her the Marquis, whom she had recently met. The guy kindly helped to collect all the documents and offered help. He decided that all this should be taken to Theo's office and headed there. Frightened, Irene refused to help and asked Marquis to stop. Hales convinced Irene that he needed to meet with the prince and discuss something with him. The guy, not shy, asked Irene what was between her and Theo. The last time they met, Hales noticed how worried the prince was about Irene. The girl asked Hales to call her you. The guy agreed, but started turning everything into a joke. Irene was a little nervous. Hales thought that the girl looked very cheerful when she was nervous. The Marquis regretted meeting Irene in such a strange way. This was not how he imagined their next meeting. The guy did not want to face the girl at all and confuse her documents. Hales said that he would like to meet Irene when she wants to. The girl looked at the boy with surprise. She did not understand what he was implying. The cunning young man offered to arrange their next meeting. The guy said ordinary things with heavy words. Irene didn't really like such a conversation. The guy behaved rather arrogantly. Soon, they came under the prince's office. Irene took the documents and thanked Hayes profusely. It seemed to the guy that the girl was addressing him too formally, and he asked to be addressed simply by his first name. The Marquis waved to Irene and left. It occurred to the girl that the boy was somehow strange. She was also surprised that they met again, but already in the palace where she worked. Irene was wrong, thinking that she and Hales would not see each other often. Very quickly, their meeting took place again. The guy seemed to be stalking Irene, and it started to annoy her. The meeting took place in the garden on the territory of the palace. Hales believed that 3 coincidences in a row is fate. Irene lowered her eyes and offered to lead the boy to His Majesty Theo, thinking he was heading there. Much to Irene's surprise, Hales had come to speak to her. The girl directly asked if he was interested in her. Marquis took Irene's hands and nodded his head. The girl considered it unnecessary, but jerked her hands. The boy was surprised that Irene had not guessed about it earlier. Hales tried to take the basket of clothes the girl was holding, but Irene did not want to have anything to do with the boy, so as not to get into trouble. The girl tried to pretend that she did not hear the words of the Marquis. Only Theo lived in Irene's heart, and she did not want to communicate with other men. The girl was also afraid that the prince would see her with the Marquis and get angry. Hales tried to find out the reason for the girl's refusal. Irene explained that her heart was busy, without going into details. She wished the boy a good day and left. Marquis understood that the girl would not open her heart just like that. In the Empire of Veronica, a strange connection was established between the imperial family and the church. Their relationship depended on the benevolence of the emperor towards the church. The throne was occupied by a deeply religious man. If the emperor found out that the divine avatar proposed by the church was false and that there was a real one, then His Majesty would generously reward the one who pointed it out. Hales decided to leave for a short time. The boy had a great idea in his head. It remains only to implement it. The Marquis believed that his 2 frequent visits would go unnoticed by the prince, but Theo noticed everything perfectly. His Majesty was staring intently out the window and watching Hales. The prince was not happy with such a guest. Theo noticed how the boy found reasons to meet with his beloved. The prince's anger was accumulating. He no longer wished to see the Marquis of Tilford in his palace. Theo didn't even know the man's name. Basil, who was nearby, told him. Also, the assistant asked the prince to be polite, because he is a member of the imperial family and should behave properly. Theo wondered why the Marquis visited his palace so often. It occurred to the prince that the boy was coming to spend time with Irene. Angered, Theo rushed towards the door and went to Irene. The prince wanted to talk to the Marquis tête-à-tête as soon as possible. Stunned, Basil watched Theo's behavior. The assistant realized how much the prince was in love. He was madly jealous of Irene. Theo broke into his lover's room. The poor girl shuddered from the unexpectedness. She did not understand why the prince was so angry and agitated. Theo grabbed the girl's hand and wanted to talk immediately. He wished to know all the details, for he did not like the polite conversation of the Marquis and Irene. The prince was not immune to jealousy. He pushed Irene onto the bed and lay on top of her. The man wanted to know if his beloved was hiding anything from him. Theo asked Irene directly if she had seen the Marquis that day. The girl was not joking. She didn't know if she should deceive the prince. Irene took a deep breath and decided not to hide anything. Irene confirmed that she and the Marquis had seen each other in the garden. The prince was interested in how often the Marquis came to see his beloved. Irene's palms were sweaty. She was very worried about upsetting Theo. Since the girl already had a problem, she did not want to create another one. Irene said that it was only the 3rd time she had seen Hales. The prince was interested in all the details of their conversation. The man was indignant that some Marquis was not giving passage to his girlfriend. Irene decided to tell Theo how everything really was. The Marquis only asked where she was going and also helped her carry a stack of papers to the office. Irene assured her lover that there was nothing like that between them. The girl took Theo's hand and swore that it belonged only to him. She convinced Theo that he was the only one who lived in her heart. The prince was ashamed of his behavior because he immediately rushed to Irene with complaints. For some time, the young people lay in silence, holding hands. Theo asked if Irene liked him. The man had never heard such words from his beloved. The girl hugged the prince, saying that she had feelings for him. Theo was over the moon with happiness. He has already forgotten about his jealousy. Irene decided to ask her lover why he treated the Marquis like that. The prince was only afraid that another man might take the heart of his beloved. Theo didn't really understand why Irene liked him. The girl also had the same question for the prince. Theo believed that Irene was doing a lot for him. He could never imagine how hard it is to work for others. Irene was surprised, because many people work for the emperor just as fruitfully. It turned out that the prince liked everyone. Theo objected. It turned out that this is not the reason at all. No matter how hard the prince tried, he couldn't explain the reason to Irene. The man said that at one point he started waiting to meet her and fell in love. Theo hugged and began to kiss his beloved. He was infinitely glad that he was finally happy. The prince was annoyed that Irene was an ordinary maid. The man was ashamed of the scene he had created. He loved Irene so much that he could not even see her with other men. The prince understood that he had to restrain his emotions. Irene explained to Theo that her meeting with the Marquis was indeed a coincidence. She convinced her beloved not to worry, because her heart forever belongs only to him. After the conversation, Theo still couldn't calm down. The man realized how much he hated the Marquis. He was ready to kill him immediately. Monet and Basil watched Theo. They considered such behavior of the prince abnormal. Monet wondered how long the Marquis had been interested in Miss Irene. Theo looked up and said as far as he knew from the farewell ceremony. It occurred to Monet that the Marquis saw the same thing as she did. As Irene prayed, wings seemed to grow behind her. The woman assumed that the Marquis had seen it with his own eyes. Monet did not want to go into details, but decided to remain silent. Before, she thought that no one saw it except her. The prince suspected something strange, because Monet abruptly fell silent. It seemed to the man that she was hiding something from him. The woman pretended not to understand what the prince hinted at. However, after talking with Irene, Theo felt better, because the girl admitted that she liked him. These words really warmed the prince's soul, because now he was sure that his feelings were definitely mutual. Irene went to the garden for flowers. There she met a gardener. The girl forgot to change the water, so her flowers dried up a little. The man gave advice to Irene, saying that plants are very sensitive, so they need to be taken care of. The gardener held out a red rose to Irene. He called the girl to follow him. The man wanted to show Irene what a beautiful garden he had grown. Suddenly, a stuttering servant came running. He asked the gardener to check the decorations of the banquet hall. The man promised to return very soon, but allowed Irene to collect flowers as she liked. Irene sat down and began to examine the flowers. There were a lot of them, and their colors were varied and rich. The girl noticed that they were paler last time. Irene plucked one of the flowers and fell in love with it. The girl had an uncontrollable desire to decorate His Majesty's office with flowers. Suddenly, the Marquis appeared next to the girl. She jumped up from surprise. Irene greeted kindly. The man felt that Irene felt uncomfortable around him. Hales asked Irene what she was doing here. The girl said that she came for flowers. She was also anxious to find out what the Marquis was doing here, because their meetings had become suspiciously random. The girl invited the boy to look at the garden, because it was extremely beautiful. It occurred to Hales that Irene wanted to put together a bouquet. The man wanted to help, but began to pluck the flower from the ground, but did only worse. The beautiful flower in Hales's hands faded a little. The man apologized, because he thought that you could pick flowers just like that, but it turned out that they need to be cut. The girl asked if the Marquis liked flowers. Unfortunately, the husband did not like them. He asked what exactly they were to the girl's liking. Irene, fascinated by the flowers, said that they were beautiful and smelled good. They can also beautify everyday life and lift the mood perfectly. Irene wondered if the Marquis was tired of everyday life. Hales was getting very tired indeed. As soon as he finished one job, he waited for the next one to appear. Sometimes the joy of success was replaced by boredom. Irene handed Hales a red rose. She asked to put it in her house and admitted that maybe he would eventually start to like her. The girl suggested starting with roses because they are flowers of unusual beauty. Irene also held tulips in her hands, inhaling their pleasant aroma. The Marquis's heart began to beat faster. The man himself did not understand what was the matter. Irene smiled at the Marquis, but hoped that now the man would stop being indifferent to plants. The man thanked and felt embarrassed. He was impressed by the fact that the girl was so skillful in dealing with flowers. Irene was so lost in the flowers that she completely forgot about the things that were waiting for her. The girl said goodbye and hurried to leave. Hale stared at Irene's trail for a long time. The man also looked at the rose she gave him. Irene came back from the garden, and Tempo was already waiting for her, looking too worried. The girl explained that she went for flowers, and for her time flew by in an instant. The beauty of flowers enchanted Irene so much that she forgot in time. Tempo hastened to inform that Sonia is a divine avatar, now in the palace. Irene could not believe it. Her heart was out of place. Theo wanted to know the reason why the avatar visited his palace. The woman said that the reason was only that she wanted to see him, because in her opinion, they did not manage to say goodbye properly at the ceremony. Theo thought such a reason was ridiculous. The man thought that Sonia wanted to tell him more serious things. The prince had absolutely no mood and desire to communicate with the woman, but still behaved patiently and agreed to listen to her. Sonia was immediately asked if Theo was happy about her visit. The man was surprised by such a question, but replied that it did not matter. He believed that the woman was simply taking his precious time. The avatar asked Theo's opinion about the farewell ceremony. She was uncomfortable speaking, but she wanted to understand the prince. Theo had no idea what this woman was up to. Sonia began to tell the story of her life. Almost immediately after graduating from the academy, she entered the temple. Outside the temple, she was an ordinary girl, but in the church itself, she held a lower position, so she was treated badly. On one of those difficult days, the ball suddenly hit Sonia in the head. At that moment, Prince Theo appeared and scolded the servant, who carelessly kicked the ball in the wrong direction. Since then, Theo has become a special man for Sogi. Later, the girl became his divine avatar. She believed that she was also special for the prince. She only had to try a little so that the man would notice her. The prince, having listened to the whole story in silence, did not even move. He believed that it was not necessary for him to know this. Theo felt some dislike for Sonia. The man did not want to communicate with her. The woman wanted to speak with the emperor. She had hoped that because of his majesty, the emperor would somehow be able to influence Theo. Irene wanted to come to Theo's office as soon as possible. The girl decided to prepare tea for the prince and Sonia, and under this pretext to come in. Irene leisurely spread the cups on the table and poured tea into them even more slowly. Theo didn't want to hide anything from Irene, so the man started talking as loudly as possible. The prince said that his father wanted to marry him to Sonia as soon as possible. The prince immediately cut off that he did not need it. The man decided to put all the dots above and, looking sternly at Sonia, he told her not to count on anything because he was not going to get married, and nothing could convince him. Theo specifically made such a statement when his lover was in the office. He did not want Irene to believe the gossip, but to hear everything personally. Sonia instead lowered her head and remained silent. The man, having finished the conversation, decided to hurry Sonia. He directly said that it was time for the woman to go, because they had discussed everything. Theo justified this by saying that he is very busy and has no time for nonsense. The prince promised Sonia that he would personally speak with His Majesty the Emperor. The woman understood that the conversation was finally over, so she had no choice but to get up and leave. Finally, the avatar said that she could not command her heart. Irene noticed that the divine avatar wanted to be with Prince Theo. Irene closely watched Sonia's behavior. As the woman cried, she reminded Irene of herself a few days ago. Crying Sonia headed for the door, realizing that her happiness had stubbornly slipped out of her hands. When Sonia left, Theo noticed that Irene was in a bad mood. He inquired about the girl's well-being, because she did not look her best. Irene's hands were shaking, and the dishes she was holding rattled violently. The man did not hold back, but put a tray with dishes on the table. The man was convinced that the reason was his conversation with Sonia. He didn't want his beloved to worry about nonsense, so he grabbed her hand and started kissing her. On the other hand, Theo was glad that Irene was jealous of Sonia. He considered it one of the highest manifestations of feelings, because it only proved that he was not indifferent to her. Theo, without stopping, continued to kiss his beloved. The prince whispered in Irene's ear that he would never marry Sonia. He was sure that his father would not be able to convince him otherwise. Irene admitted that she was very jealous, but her heart was not in the right place. It seemed strange to Irene that she imagined and seemed to feel Sonia's feelings. Irene was happy that Theo liked her. The thought did not leave the girl that her husband was too worried. Theo could not imagine how else he could prove the sincerity of his feelings and intentions. He grabbed Irene tightly and lifted her up, saying that it belonged only to her. In Irene's opinion, these were very serious things to say, just like that. Irene promised Theo that she wouldn't worry anymore. Next to her husband, she felt like she was behind a stone wall, and her soul became calm. Soon, Theo decided to go to his father and talk to him. The emperor was frankly surprised that his son had arrived without warning. Theo said that there was gossip in the palace about his marriage. The prince frankly, without fear, began to accuse his father. The man was sure that it was the emperor's servants who spread the gossip. The father did not like this conversation and the son's tone. Theo, having killed the emperor, immediately said that he was not going to marry Sonia. The man was as steadfast as a rock. The emperor once again tried to suggest that his son think things through. The man wanted nothing but happiness for his son, but he did not understand why he resisted so much. According to the emperor, Theo should be grateful that he has his avatar. The emperor was convinced that Theo was still alive only because of the avatar. The husband could not understand why his son did not understand elementary things. The emperor did not stop insisting on the wedding because he understood that his son's life could end at any moment. Theo said that after the death of the mother, the father took care of his children with all his love. Later, the emperor heard a prediction that one of his sons would soon die. Theo understood how hurt his father was. He fell silent. The man lowered his head and hoped that his father would understand him. Theo did not reject the idea that maybe if he had not met his love, he would have married Sonia. But now the heart of the prince was owned by Irene, and he could not override his feelings. Theo admitted to his father that he already had a lover. The emperor was surprised, because he had heard about it for the first time. He wanted to know who this lucky girl was. With all due respect to his father, Theo could not name his beloved. The man promised that he would definitely introduce them in the future. The father finally understood why his son did not want a relationship with Sonia. The emperor also decided that he would stop forcing marriage with the avatar. The emperor was happy for his son, that he was in love. Theo asked that his father tell the church that he did not agree with their decision. The emperor was too often worried about his son because his character was not the best. The emperor wanted to know who this mysterious girl was. He did not understand why the son was hiding his chosen one. Theo arrived at his estate. Monet met him. He was glad that his conversation with his father had finally taken place, and he would leave him alone with the subject of marriage. The prince asked what Coins thought about his wedding with Irene. The woman decided that Theo had confessed who his lover was to the emperor, but it was not so. The prince was afraid of his father's reaction to the fact that his beloved was a maid. Theo was also very worried about Irene. He was afraid to make life difficult for the girl. The prince was worried that after hearing that, his father would be able to expel her. Monet decided to take the girl's side, explaining that the aristocrats would be able to prevent the emperor from expelling her. Not everyone held such views as Theo. After Monet's words, the prince had hope that he would still be able to persuade his father. But the man was confused about whether they would be able to marry if the aristocracy was against it. The man was in a bad mood, but he was not feeling well. Irene only opened her heart to Theo, and the problems did not end there. Theo could not have imagined that there would be so many obstacles due to the difference in status. Monet said she knew a way to solve this problem. The man couldn't wait to hear what the woman meant. Monet decided to tell what happened to Irene on the territory of the temple. Monet began the conversation by saying that Irene was special. Theo interrupted the woman when he saw someone gouging his eyes. He saw the Marquis again, but he was very angry. The prince had no idea that this brat had forgotten. Monet recognized the man as the Marquis of Tilford, who had lately visited the prince's estate too often. The woman witnessed how the Marquis was heading towards Irene. Meanwhile, Irene was in the garden. Theo was beside himself with anger because the Marquis constantly visited the girl. Monet suggested that the prince speak to the Marquis directly and ask what he needed from Irene. To begin with, the prince wanted to follow Tilfad and see what he would do. Theo and Monet watched as the man approached Irene. The moment came when Hales was already next to Irene. He politely asked the girl how she was doing. The guy also thanked for the flower that Irene gave him last meeting. Irene was pleasantly surprised that Hales still left the flower at his house because he said that he did not like flowers. The guy wanted to flatter Irene and said he couldn't throw away the gift she gave him. The girl said that she tried to propagate flowers with cuttings. This is when you need to plant branches again. Irene was holding a flower pot, and Hales wondered what the name of the plant was. The man leaned quite close to her, and this alarmed the girl. Turning her head, Irene saw Theo and Monet watching her and the Marquis intently. Irene was stunned by what she saw. The girl understood that the Marquis was threatened with trouble. The boy, seeing the prince, bowed to him and greeted him. Theo turned to Irene, saying that he had a meeting in half an hour. He asked Irene to prepare everything necessary. Meanwhile, the prince intended to chat with the Marquis. Irene was frightened, but humbly nodded her head and left. The men remained tete. Theo told the Marquis that he was not happy about his presence in the estate, because the boy did not come to him, but to his maid. The prince inquired directly whether the Marquis admired his servants. The boy nodded his head affirmatively. Theo was furious, because Hales didn't even try to hide his intentions. The Marquis said that this was not at all the hobby that the prince had thought of. The cocky Hales hinted that Theo has feelings for Irene, but he has completely different motives. The prince decided that their conversation would pass quickly. Theo, in a threatening voice, ordered Hales to stop hanging around Irene. The Marquis laughed, but began to convince the prince that he had misunderstood. The guy explained that he has no feelings for the girl. The prince demanded an explanation, because he saw with his own eyes how the Marquis flirted with his beloved. The guy explained that he was trying to get to know the real Irene more. Monet guessed that the Marquis somehow knew about it, as did she. The boy had no idea whether the prince knew what he knew. Hales believed that he had no right to tell a secret that he himself was not yet sure of. Theo was madly angry because the Marquis could not clearly explain to him the reason for his behavior. The boy bowed to the prince and asked for forgiveness because he was not sure that the information he had was reliable. Theo did not understand anything from their conversation. The Marquis had some secret that he could not tell. This made Theo very confused. Hales would be overjoyed if Irene turned out to be a divine avatar, but he had to figure it out for himself first before informing the royal household. The man was sure that if he hastens, he will be destroyed not only by his family, but also by the church. He did not want to act thoughtlessly. Theo, returning to the office, was not himself. But the man knew one thing. Basil and Hales were suspicious of Irene, but of what it was not known. Monet decided not to torture the prince, but to tell him everything she saw. Theo did not have the strength or desire to listen to the woman because his head was full of problems. The man asked to postpone the conversation to another day. Stubborn Monet insisted on an immediate conversation. The woman asked for forgiveness because she herself could not believe what she once saw. Monet said that the Marquis doubts Irene for a reason. The prince did not know how to listen calmly, so he interrupted every word. Much to Theo's surprise, Monet knew what the Marquis meant. The woman tried to understand what kind of person Irene was. According to Monet, at the last ceremony, she looked into the temple and saw Irene praying there. At that time, butterflies were flying around the girl, and there was also a lot of light. It was like a miracle. The coin seemed to be a sign of revelation. Basil once told a woman how this sign manifests itself. The light was very similar to the one described by the prince's assistant. Theo immediately wondered if the Marquis had been there, and if he had seen Irene as well. Monet lowered her head and did not know what to answer. She did not see anyone in the hall then, but judging by what the boy was saying, he saw it too. Theo finally understood why the Marquis was hanging around Irene. He decided to get close to her after seeing the sign of revelation. Theo had no idea why the light appeared next to Irene. Monet said that Irene was praying at that time. She considered it unusual because she had never seen anything like it with her own eyes before. Theo reminisced. The man recalled a conversation with Basil, in which it was discussed that the man was taking theological courses instead of studying in the seminary. Irene also appeared in Theo's memories when she told that she knew the ancient language of Almata. The man had some suspicions, but he thought it was too early to think and talk about it. Basil had long thought that Irene was behaving strangely. He even wrote about it in letters to Monet. Basil was convinced that Irene was a spy for the church, so it was necessary to talk to the man. It occurred to Theo that if Irene found out about Basil's suspicions, it would hurt her greatly. The prince asked Monet not to tell Basil anything until they were absolutely sure. What was important to Theo was that such phenomena are really unusual. The prince regretted that he was the last to know about everything. Meanwhile, Irene was worried and was afraid that the situation would only get worse. The girl sincerely hoped that the men's conversation went well because no news was heard. The girl caught herself thinking that she was very worried. It occurred to her that they might have an argument, or worse, a fight. In the situation with His Majesty, he also misunderstood everything. Irene tried everything to calm herself down. The girl regretted not overhearing the conversation. Although Irene had done nothing wrong, she still felt terrible. Irene was well aware of the prince's feelings for her. The girl did not want to lose him due to some misunderstanding. Suddenly, Irene saw Sonia and did not understand why she had returned. Irene politely turned to Sonia, asking if she needed help. The woman was looking for His Majesty Theo and wanted to know where he was now, because the man was not in the office. The prince was busy because he had a meeting at that moment. Irene felt uncomfortable and did not know how to behave because she and the woman were left alone. Sonia did not reject the idea that the prince was avoiding her. Irene began to refute Sonia's words. Although she personally did not want to see the woman, Sonia suggested that Irene wait for Prince Theo together, justifying it by the fact that she would be too sad alone. Irene, seeing the avatar, realized that even if the prince liked her, he would not marry an ordinary girl. Sonia was in a great mood and wanted to talk to the maid. Irene had no idea what topics they would talk about, so she decided to avoid the conversation. Irene offered to take Sonia to the office where the prince was now. The girl paid attention to how beautiful Sonia is. The thought that her lover could marry this woman did not leave her. Irene did not know what she was doing because she was leading Sonia to Theo's office. The girl had many thoughts in her head. Irene was interested in why Sonia visited the estate again. When the prince banished the woman, she declared that she could not accept rejection. Irene was troubled by the thought of what the woman wanted to say to the prince this time. Irene suggested that Sonia sit on a comfortable sofa and wait a little. Sonia recognized the maid who brought tea last time. It was her, Irene. The girl was a little surprised, because aristocrats in most cases do not remember the faces of servants. Sonia had too much going on that day, so she didn't get the chance to try Irene's brewed tea. The woman wanted to make up for what she had missed, so she immediately started drinking tea. She complimented Irene on the wonderful tea, which had a wonderful aroma. The girl was troubled by the thought that Sonia remembered her. The woman knew that Irene was His Majesty's closest maid, so she had several questions for the girl. Sonia was interested in what His Majesty loved. It was difficult for Irene to talk about this topic. After thinking about it, the girl came to the conclusion that she had no idea what Theo liked. She knew better what he didn't like. Irene didn't expect to hear this kind of question from Sonia. Irene was confused, but said that His Majesty likes tea. She herself realized that she had said something stupid because she did not want to talk about such a topic. Irene realized for herself that she liked the prince so much that she had no idea what his favorite things were and what he liked. Then the girl decided that her feelings for the prince were not strong enough. Irene saw in Sonia a person who is very attentive to any little things. Irene decided not to continue the rather uncomfortable conversation for her and went to ask when the meeting would end. Irene envied Sonia because the woman was not ashamed of her curiosity. At the time, Irene and His Majesty were as if from different worlds, and this thought did not leave her. While Irene was thinking, Theo came out of the office and gently put his arm around her waist. The girl began to worry that someone would see, but Theo assured that the meeting was already over and there was no one around. Theo hinted to his beloved that they could go to another, more peaceful place. The prince, sitting down in his work chair, stretched out his hands to the girl and called her to him. He wanted to kiss her endlessly. Theo wondered what Irene had been up to in his absence. The girl remembered Sonia, who was waiting for Theo, because she needed to be warned about the end of the meeting. Irene didn't even move her tongue to warn the prince about it. Theo saw that Irene was hiding something and wanted the details. He decided that Sonia had offended his lover. The girl denied Theo's words, saying that they were just talking. It occurred to Theo that he knew absolutely nothing about Irene's preferences. The man wanted to know all the details. He held the girl tightly and looked into her eyes. Theo, who was head over heels in love, eagerly awaited all the details. Irene, in turn, also wanted to know something special about her beloved. The prince did not hold back and began to caress the girl. His strong hands pressed her closer to him. Passion seized the man, and he began to kiss Irene without stopping. In fact, Theo wanted something more, but this was not the best time to continue, because the man had a lot of unfinished business that needed to be solved as soon as possible. The man called Irene heartless because he was trying to please his beloved, and she looked as if he was doing something wrong. Irene objected, but said that she liked everything. Theo had a crazy idea. He decided not to waste time and make love right in his office. The man's heart was beating so hard that he decided not to restrain himself. Irene ruined such a passionate moment by talking about the avatar. The girl admitted that Sonia was sitting on the sofa and waiting for the end of the meeting. Theo was angry, but he was not happy about such a visit. Irene told Theo that Sonia wanted to talk to him. Theo concluded that this pushy woman was pushing herself. He believed that they had discussed everything last time. Irene understood that Sonia Dale was not going to back down from His Majesty. She tried to do everything in her power to get closer to the prince. The man, being worried, told Irene that he had already informed his father that he had no intention of marrying this woman. Theo also informed the emperor that he already had a lover. Such words made Irene a little uneasy. She was very afraid that Theo confessed to the emperor about his feelings for her. The girl did not stop thinking for a minute about the difference in their statuses. Theo continued to reassure Irene, telling her that he loved her madly, and there was no way he would marry Sonia. The girl could not believe that the emperor would approve of such a decision of his son. Irene came to her senses and remembered that Sonia was still waiting for Theo. The man had no idea why the girl let Sonia come here. Irene explained that she could not contradict the woman because she did not dare to do so. Theo reluctantly agreed to talk with Sonia. He could not understand what this nagging woman wanted from him. The man decided to dot all the dots and tell her the same thing as his father. The prince was frankly fed up with the talk about marriage and the fact that Sonia was trying to at least make friends with him. The man grabbed Irene by the hand and asked her to go with him. He was indignant because only one problem disappeared and another immediately appeared. Meanwhile, Sonia was still enjoying her tea. Without realizing it herself, the woman drank a whole teapot. She couldn't wait for His Majesty to come. Sonia could not believe what she saw. Suddenly, the prince came to her, holding the hand of the maid Irene. This really confused Sonia, and she understood the reason for her husband's refusal. The prince looked tense, assuring them that the last time they had finished talking. Sonia, out of surprise, greeted and bowed to His Majesty. Irene literally pulled her hand out of Theo's, but the man nervously grabbed the girl's hand again. He wanted Sonia to finally understand the seriousness of his intentions with regard to Irene and leave him alone. Sonia pretended that she did not understand the prince. Theo, staring intently at Sonia, announced that their wedding would never take place because he already had a lover. The man hoped that this conversation with the avatar would be the last. Enraged, Theo asked not to stand in his way again. He said it very threateningly. Also, the prince asked not to seek a meeting with him because he does not want it. Sonia turned out to be morally stronger than the prince expected. She raised her head and asked Theo if he considered her an obstacle. The woman was more than sure that His Majesty would not allow young people to be together. Sonia was very offended by her husband's words. She thought that she was not worth worrying about him, but it turned out that the prince did not even think of marrying her. Sonia pondered Theo's words and asked to think carefully about relations with the church. The prince took her words as if she was advising him to think about the consequences. But this did not scare the man at all. Theo asked not to be intimidated by the church. It seemed to Sonia that the prince was really not bluffing, and he was worried about the opinion of others. He was sure of his steadfast decision, but he was not going to change anything. Sonia shouted after Theo, who was about to leave, that they were bound by fate. The woman got angry and shouted that she was his divine avatar. Sonia also insisted that the prince should rely on God to be strong. Much to Sonia's surprise, Theo became surprisingly calm and informed her that she could use the title as much as she wanted. It occurred to the woman that Theo had guessed that she was not the real avatar. Theo exclaimed that he had no intention of limiting Sonia's authority over the church. The man repeated once again that he was not going to marry her. Sonia thought it was funny and pointless. Sonia didn't know what to think of. The woman understood that she was at a dead end. She continued to praise the prince that he was a smart man and had once saved her life. The woman continued to insist that their marriage take place after all. Theo just squeezed Irene's hand tightly and asked Sonia for forgiveness. In a fit of anger, Sonia told Theo that he would soon regret what he had done. Irene was scared because she understood that she was the obstacle between Sonia and Theo. When the young people left for a more secluded place where no one was there, Irene was able to calm down. She asked the prince if he was feeling well. The man was glad that he finally made Sonia understand that they should never be together. In fact, Irene was very worried about the future of the prince, because she was convinced that it would lead to a quarrel between the imperial family and the church. The girl was too deep in her thoughts. It occurred to Theo to cheer up Irene a little, as she looked quite serious. The girl could not forget Sonia's words. They sounded quite threatening from her lips. Irene was upset because she felt guilty about everything. Hugging Irene, Theo said that he was ready to do anything to make her happy with him. It was very important to the prince that his beloved lived peacefully. Irene was not very picky in life, and only the prince's love was enough for her. Theo hugged Irene and started kissing her. The man could not imagine his life without this woman. Soon the young people found themselves in bed. The prince promised that he would never marry Sonia. The man had thought about everything for a long time and even had a worthy suitor for her. Theo tirelessly kissed his beloved without stopping. There had been no closeness between them for a long time, so Irene was worried. Theo and Irene dissolved into kisses and hugs. Most of all, the man wanted this moment to never end, because they were so good together. But the cunning Theo wanted Irene to promise him something. The man demanded that Irene completely stop communicating with the Marquis. The girl could not imagine how she could refuse the young man if she was an ordinary maid. Theo wanted Irene to have a serious talk with the Marquis on the subject. Irene considered this a rather difficult task for herself, because the Marquis is a person of the highest level, and she could not say anything to him that would upset him. Theo decided that Irene was worth coming up with an excuse to keep Hales off of her. The girl could not even imagine what she could come up with. Theo asked to invent something for him, because the man was really terribly jealous of Irene. Theo shared that he could no longer bear to see Irene and the Marquis together. He personally observed how the Marquis flirted more and more with the girl. Theo managed to convince Irene of his position. Irene had no idea why the Marquis was so nice to her. The girl did not want to make Prince Theo nervous. Besides, she rejected the idea that she really liked Hales. Irene was convinced that the Marquis was well aware of her relationship with Theo, so she was preparing herself to have a serious talk with the boy and explain everything to him. No matter how much the girl thought, she could not think of how to properly inform the Marquis. Suddenly, the boy appeared in front of her. It was a surprise for Irene, because she had not yet thought things through. The Marquis greeted kindly. Irene was expecting his arrival because it had already become a kind of tradition. The girl tuned into the conversation, but a cold ran over her skin. The Marquis noticed that Irene was too excited. It occurred to Hales that Irene was waiting for him, because the girl's behavior seemed strange to him. The guy asked Irene to be more open with him and share what is on her heart. The girl gathered her thoughts and admitted that she had planned to tell the Marquis something. The boy wanted to know as soon as possible what Irene planned to tell him. The girl looked rather sad, so Hales tried to cheer her up. The guy jokingly suggested that he would try to guess what it would be about. The first thing that occurred to Hales was that Irene liked him, but the Marquis missed because his answer turned out to be wrong. Irene shared that she already has a person whom she loves. The girl hinted that the Marquis already guessed about everything. Hales felt confused because he did not fully understand what Irene was implying. The girl apologized and also said to forget everything she said. Irene decided to explain everything to the Marquis once again, but in such a way that he would understand what was being said. At first, Irene was sure that the boy liked her as a girl, but later she realized that it was some other kind of sympathy. It occurred to Hales that Irene didn't want their meetings to continue, but the stubborn boy saw nothing wrong with that. He also said that Irene is not indifferent to him. On this day, Irene could not dare to tell the Marquis anything. The girl remembered that she had promised Theo that she must gather courage and talk to the boy. For a long time, the prince could not understand why his beloved dragged the conversation so much and could not immediately talk to Hales about this topic. Theo wanted to know what Irene would do if it turned out that he really liked her. Irene was definitely sure that she would not reciprocate Hales because her heart already belonged to another man, Prince Theo. Hales complimented Irene and told her how wonderful she was. The boy also asked not to worry too much about his words. Irene could not understand why the Marquis was so sure that he liked her so much. Hales began to open his soul to Irene too much, telling that she is one of the few with whom he communicates. The boy hoped that Irene felt comfortable in his company. It occurred to the Marquis that Prince Theo might be watching them at the moment, so the boy decided to leave, because Theo was sure to misunderstand everything. Hales was about to leave, and Irene thanked him for listening to her. The girl was worried, because the appearance of the Marquis wanted to be better. The guy felt bad. He thought he knew how to lie, but it was quite difficult for him. Hales was trying to come to his senses, because he still had a lot of work to do. Irene decided it was time to talk to Theo, as he had been a little rough lately. Irene sincerely hoped that her lover would finally stop being jealous of her for the Marquis. The girl decided not to waste time and immediately go to the prince. Entering the study, she found that Theo was absent. The man was in the room. He just sat on another chair and dozed off. It occurred to Irene that Theo was tired. She came closer to the prince and offered to lie down in bed. The girl admired her lover, straightening his hair. Theo was sleeping too soundly, so Irene decided not to wake him, but to let him rest a little longer. The man suddenly opened his eyes and asked if Irene liked watching him sleep. It seemed to the girl that Theo was about to fall. She got scared and shouted for him to be more careful. The prince liked how Irene stroked him. She had done this before, and he thought she was going to kiss him. Irene smiled and apologized for waking up her lover. The man actually woke up when Irene first entered. But he didn't show it because he wanted to see what she would do. The man pretended to be asleep so skillfully that he didn't even move. The prince was too tired. The first thing he wanted to see when he opened his eyes was Irene. The girl smiled sweetly and offered to rest some more. The man gently hugged Irene, and his tiredness passed in an instant. Theo became warm and calm at heart. The girl said that she had good news. She said that she had finally spoken to the Marquis. Irene was convinced that Halks understood everything because she told him that she had a lover. The prince was happy to hear. He had been tormenting Irene all last night, insisting on talking to Hales. Now the prince was glad that his efforts were not in vain. Theo was interested in all the details and Hales's reaction. Irene had a strange feeling after saying goodbye to the Marquis because he told her that he knew everything. The prince was surprised, and it was unexpected for him. He was convinced that the Marquis would be more persistent. The man didn't want to talk about Hales anymore because he wasn't worth it. The prince began to kiss the girl. He repeated over and over how much he loved Irene. Previously, Theo was convinced that the Marquis felt the same way about Irene as he did. So the man felt pleased that the Marquis had surrendered so quickly. Theo hugged his beloved, and they kissed for a long time, enjoying each other. Their kisses became more passionate and violent. Young people made love. Their romantic atmosphere was interrupted by Basil, who knocked on the office. Theo covered Irene's mouth with his hand so she wouldn't make a sound. The prince insisted that the assistant not enter the office because he had an important guest. Irene's heart almost jumped out of her chest. The girl was always worried that someone would see them like this. Theo insisted on continuing, but Basil was waiting outside the door, so it had to be finished. Young people began to dress. Basil went first, but asked Irene to take her time. The girl understood that it was necessary to wait a little in order to avoid unnecessary suspicions. Irene didn't want to face Basil. She couldn't think of anything better to start cleaning the prince's room. Chaos and disorder reigned on the table, so Irene decided to clean it up first. The girl had no idea why the prince left her documents aside. Irene began to read, but she was overcome with horror. Panic followed. The girl read information about herself in the documents. Suddenly, documents flew around the room. Irene, nervously, with trembling hands, began to collect them. The girl was scared because there was much more information about her than in the documents she was preparing for work. Irene read her entire autobiography there. It couldn't be fuller. The girl's heart was not in place because she definitely did not expect to see such a thing. Irene well remembered that the documents she submitted for work were completely wrong. The girl did not understand why the prince collected everything about her past. Irene had no idea why Theo did it. The girl decided that the prince was suspicious of her because she had no other options. Running through everything in her head, Irene couldn't think of anything suspicious about her actions. Even the information that she told about her family was recorded in every detail. Irene had a lot of questions. It occurred to her that the prince wanted to see if she was deceiving him. Irene forgot about time. Suddenly, she looked at her watch and noticed that she had been reviewing documents for a very long time. The girl was in a hurry to put everything in its place because the prince was about to return to his office. Irene's heart was heavy because she trusted her husband with all her heart, and he did so. The girl scrolled through various points in her head, but could not understand what was the reason for collecting all the information. After a while, Irene calmed down a bit, but still she kept thinking about the documents and the prince's motives. The maid came up to Irene, and she was so confused that she accidentally touched the teapot and the fruit jar. A colleague scolded Irene for her inattention. She noticed that something had happened because the girl was making too many mistakes, and her appearance was not the best. Irene did not want to tell anyone about the pain, because she wanted to understand everything herself first. She did not know whether it was worth talking to the prince about this topic, although she understood that there was no way without it. Irene turned to His Majesty Theo. She lowered her head and asked if the prince had a moment to spare. The man was intrigued by such a strange beginning to the conversation. He did not understand why his beloved asked such a question. Irene took a long time adjusting, but still decided to talk to her husband. She could feel her voice beginning to shake as she was afraid to hear the answer. The girl pulled out the documents she found in Theo's office. She tentatively held them out to the prince. The man did not expect such a turn of events, because Irene was never supposed to see them. The prince wanted to know exactly where Irene took the documents. The girl, not hiding anything, told how everything happened. She demanded an immediate explanation from the prince. The girl was indignant, justifying it by the fact that she did not submit such documents when she got a job at the palace. Irene was disappointed by the prince's behavior because he collected all her data for unknown reasons. Theo decided to confess everything because there was no point in hiding anything. Irene continued to demand an explanation because everything looked as if the prince suspected her of something. The prince explained that he did not intend to collect the entire biography of the girl. He said that he was really looking for information about her, but he didn't do it because he suddenly wanted to. Since Irene was able to translate the ancient language, although she had never learned it, Basil found this very suspicious. The girl, listening to the prince, was shocked by the information she heard from his mouth. Theo justified himself that because of his disobedience to the church, it armed itself against him. The priest was trying to control the prince, so it occurred to Basil that Irene had been sent from the temple. The girl could not believe what she heard. She couldn't imagine how Basil and Theo could think that of her. Irene had already begun to doubt the truth of the prince's actions. Theo admitted that Basil had suspected her in the first place. Irene, listening to the prince, did not understand why he continued to blame Basil, because he himself took part in it. Basil is the prince's assistant, so he gathered information with His Majesty's permission. Irene did not even doubt it. She believed that she had too much faith in the man she saw in front of her. Irene watched as the prince tried to shift the blame to Basil. The girl was convinced that they were both to blame. She could not believe that her lover had done this to her. She was offended by the idea that the men suspected her. Irene had no idea that she had done such a thing to be targeted. Her heart seemed to be torn apart. She trusted this man so much, and he crossed everything out in one moment. Theo tried to convince Irene that he had to verify the information Basil had told him. The man swore that he did not even doubt Irene, although his actions indicated otherwise. Irene argued that if Theo didn't doubt her, he wouldn't have allowed Basil to collect data on her. Theo said that he had only one reason for doing so, but the man could not tell about it at the moment. Theo had no idea it could come to this. He just wanted to know what kind of strange thing happened in the temple with Irene. The man tried to convince the stubborn Basil. The prince did not know how to tell Irene about everything. Irene became very hurt. She just wanted to help the prince and did everything out of love for him. The girl could not have imagined that such a misunderstanding would arise. Irene whispered that she was not a temple scout at all. The prince felt ashamed and lowered his eyes, saying that he knew about it. nothing mattered to the girl. Theo broke her heart into little pieces. Theo chastised himself for his foolish act. He hated Basil, who tricked him into digging into Irene's past. The prince almost went mad. The thought of confessing to Irene never left him. After all, that was the only way he could atone for his guilt. Meanwhile, Irene was not in the mood at all. The girl did not understand how Theo could blame his assistant instead of himself, even if he had not been completely honest with her. Raoul rushed to Irene and informed her that the chamberlain was looking for her. Irene wondered why her husband needed her. Concerned, Irene came to the chamberlain, who informed her that the girl would be working for another person tomorrow. The man did not have time to explain. The chamberlain thought that Irene had changed her mind because her face turned white as a wall. The man was puzzled because Irene, coming last time, tearfully asked him to change jobs. This time, it seems, on the contrary, the girl did not want to go anywhere. Irene explained that there needs to be a good reason for a transfer. The girl asked her husband for some time to think and weigh everything well. Irene completely forgot that she herself came to the chamberlain and asked to find another job for her. The man said that soon there would be a vacancy for His Majesty Evan's servant, and he suggested that she try to get a job there. The man assured Irene that she has a lot of experience and she will be able to start work immediately. It was difficult for the girl to make a decision, because when she came to the chamberlain, she was sure that the prince would marry. Earlier, Irene was convinced that the wedding would definitely take place. It was just a misunderstanding, which later turned into disappointment. Theo's figure appeared before Irene's eyes. It was difficult for the girl to accept such a reality. Irene trusted Theo with all her heart and soul, and he trampled on her feelings so mercilessly. After coming to her senses, the girl decided that she still needed to change her place of work. She raised her head and said to her husband that she agreed. Irene herself did not understand whether she still wanted to work for the prince. She thought she needed to calm down, but with Prince Theo it was impossible. The man lifted the seal over the document and once again asked if Irene regretted her decision. The girl did not regret it at all. The seal was placed. In the morning, Prince Theo is confused because Irene has not come. She usually brought him documents at this time. He was waiting to meet the girl, but he had no idea what to say to her. The prince was very angry with Basil and caused him a scandal, but this did not solve the problem. Theo believed that he should apologize to Irene. There was a knock at the door, and Theo was glad that Irene had finally arrived. It was Raoul who announced that he would help the prince temporarily. Theo did not understand why a boy came instead of Irene. Raoul explained that he came with documents. The enraged prince began to shout at the boy, never getting tired of asking where Irene had gone. The man was surprised that the prince still didn't know anything, and explained that Irene had been transferred to another place of work. The chamberlain allowed her to change jobs. Raoul announced that from this day, Irene would serve Prince Evan. Theo couldn't believe what the boy was talking about. Theo was simply beside himself with anger. The prince immediately got up from his chair and wanted to talk to Irene right away. Raoul stood in front of the door and blocked the man's passage. He explained that the senior maid herself asked him to take care of her husband and then left. Raoul hastened to remind that in 10 minutes the man had an important meeting. But the prince, it seems, did not care about anything except Irene. He wanted to know the reason why Irene had changed her job. The guy kept saying that it was Irene's personal decision because she herself asked for it. Theo was losing hope. He understood what preceded such a decision. Raoul said that he was not aware of the reason, but Irene handed over the duties to him, and she was quite sad. Theo realized what a fool he was, because he had hurt his beloved too much by his own actions. The prince was upset. He wondered why Irene hadn't told him anything. The man didn't know if he should wait until she herself decided to report it. Theo was desperate. He had never encountered such a thing, and the man simply did not know what to do. Raoul interrupted his thoughts, informing him that he would be late for the meeting in a little while. Without thinking, Theo asked Raoul to cancel the upcoming meetings. The man, whatever, decided to find Irene and have a serious talk with her. Meanwhile, Irene was already in Evan's office. The prince asked to hand over the documents he had left behind after the meeting, but Irene did not seem to hear her husband. She was looking at one place in silence. The girl regained consciousness and continued to do her work. Evan noticed that Irene was confused. Until recently, he had not noticed this behind her. Irene was not herself. She apologized, smiled, and handed the papers to Prince Evan. The man was glad that Irene was working for him again. Evan guessed that the asshole Theo must have bothered Irene a lot, and he was glad she decided not to quit altogether. He believed that it would be wrong to lose such a valuable employee. In fact, Evan was very interested in what happened between Irene and Theo. His brother got so upset and asked Irene to be transferred to him, and now she's back in a terrible mood. Still, Evan was happy to have Irene helping him again. Knowing his brother, Evan was surprised Theo hadn't caused a stir yet. Before, Theo, who had never seemed greedy, suddenly wanted so badly to take the girl for himself. It was obvious to Evan that he liked her as a girl. That is why he sent Irene, thinking that they would get along. Evan felt guilty because he was responsible for Theo. The man wanted to cheer up Irene and offered her a little rest. The girl refused, claiming that she was not tired. Evan then invited Irene to go and have a cup of tea. The prince explained that Irene had not worked for him for 4 months, so he asked her not to overdo it. His Majesty Evan is not picky. Irene was glad she had been transferred to him, otherwise she might have been in trouble. The girl did not understand the reason why she could not gather herself and start working normally. In the garden, Irene met the Marquis, who immediately informed her that it was a coincidence, and he was not looking for a meeting with her. Irene didn't even have time to say anything, and the guy immediately started making excuses. Irene wondered if Hales was on his way to see Prince Evan. It was the correct answer, but the boy was confused by what Irene was doing here. Irene frankly told that she began to serve Prince Evan. The boy asked Irene if she no longer worked for Prince Theo. The girl, smiling, replied that she was not working. During the friendly conversation of the young people, Irene noticed Prince Theo and Monet heading towards Prince Evan. The girl expected that sooner or later it would happen. At this moment, Irene did not want anyone to notice her and the Marquis. The girl grabbed Hales and pulled him aside. They hid. A week has passed since Theo and Irene last met, and they have never met. Irene thought that the prince looked good without her. The girl apologized to Hales for making him hide so suddenly. The man was interested in Irene's reason for such an act. He didn't understand why they were hiding from Prince Theo. The sun shone brightly and dazzled the eyes. Irene let out a breath as Theo and Monet entered the estate. The girl understood that she would not be able to run away from Prince Theo every time like that. Irene felt uncomfortable being around the Marquis because she had drawn him into it as well. Hales asked the girl to give him a moment's attention. She was about to go somewhere, so he asked her to wait. The guy suggested Irene to visit one place. The girl was intrigued and decided to go with Hales. Irene did not regret it, because it was the first time she was so deep in the garden. A huge variety of flowers grew around her. Since Irene was very fond of flowers, she became interested in gardening. Flowers grew everywhere. The variety of colors and varieties of plants impressed the girl to the core. Butterflies were also flying there, which pleased the eye. As servants were not allowed to be in this place without permission, Irene had never been there. The girl bent the rose and inhaled its beautiful aroma. The Marquis was glad that he had managed to cheer up Irene. After the girl saw Theo, she felt a little sad. Irene was grateful that Hales had led her so far into the garden, and she saw a great variety of flowers and plants. Instead, Hales asked what had happened between Prince Theo and Irene. The guy knew for sure that they liked each other, so he suspected that something serious had happened. The rose Irene was holding fell to the ground. The girl had no idea that the Marquis would be interested in the details of her life. The girl did not want to tell anyone about it. Hales asked not to be afraid, because he was not going to tell anyone about this. From the expression on Irene's face, he noticed that the young people had definitely quarreled. The Marquis wanted to know when Irene and Theo had met for the first time. The girl, without concealing it, said that it happened several years ago, approximately 3 years ago. Hales claimed that Theo was away at war 3 years ago, and there was no way they could see each other. Irene denied the boy's words, saying that they met before he went to the service. Irene was convinced that His Majesty Theo had no memory of this meeting. The next time they met was when the prince returned to the palace after treatment. Irene was still surprised that her husband recovered so quickly. Because Prince Theo's wounds were so severe, no one had any idea that the man would appear whole and unharmed in such a short period of time. When Irene saw Prince Theo at the banquet, her heart felt like it was going to jump out of her chest. The Marquis listened to the girl's story in silence, without interrupting, and he himself seems to have plunged into past events. Then a blessing seemed to descend upon the divine avatar of the prince. Theo was in the temple due to injuries. The Marquis concluded that Irene had met the prince before Sonia. The guy didn't want to admit it to himself, but from the moment he met Irene, everything indicated that she was the divine avatar. The man was convinced that thanks to the meeting with Irene, Theo was able to survive the war. The Marquis wanted to know what the temple thought about this, because they were so sure that his true divine avatar would not make itself known. The boy did not reject the idea that the servants of the temple were going to get rid of the avatar in case of his appearance. Hales was so thoughtful that Irene noticed. It seemed to her that the boy was too worried about something. Marquise did not want to go into details, so he convinced the girl that everything was fine with him. Hale thought about telling the royal family about the divine avatar. From the beginning, he was going to use Irene. By opening everyone's eyes to the fact that Irene is a divine avatar, he could strengthen the influence of his family. However, the boy was no longer sure, because he liked Irene as a girl. Marcus could not come to a conclusion when and to whom to reveal the secret. The guy was worried that Irene might get into trouble because of the antics of the temple. He understood that he would have to stop them. In the boy's opinion, first it was necessary to find out all the weak points of the church, only then to act. He convinced himself that he would definitely make the right decision. Hales, looking at Irene, admitted to her that she was a special person. The guy asked what Irene herself thought about this. The girl could not even think about what exactly it was about. Marquis said that words are superfluous. He held out a bouquet of flowers that he picked in the garden and asked the girl to take them with her. Hales said he had other things to do and said goodbye as he had to go. Irene thanked Hales for the walk. Last time, the girl behaved rudely with the boy, but he seemed to understand everything. Irene was happy that he took her to a place of incredible beauty and comforted her. Irene received a letter from home. She has not received letters for a long time. The mail was supposed to arrive at the end of the month, but the letter was already lying in front of her. The girl was worried and assumed that something serious had happened. Irene hastened to open the letter. The girl's heart was out of place. Thoughts raged in her head, as if warning of trouble. Meanwhile, His Majesty Theo and Monet were in his office. The man had so many thoughts that he signed a blank piece of paper. Monet lowered her eyes and suggested that the documents that needed to be signed were behind her husband. Monet noticed that the man was very confused. It seems that he did not listen to Monet at all, and what she had already repeated several times. Theo took a sip of tea and apologized. Monet watched as the man suffered, but could not do anything. The prince seemed to collect his thoughts, but firmly said that he was listening to the woman. This evening, the work with the documents progressed slowly and not according to plan. Annoyed, Theo called out to Raoul, scolding the boy for not being able to make tea. Monet asked not to scold Raoul too much, because he is just as busy as Theo. Monet suggested that His Majesty rest a little, because things were going badly. The woman said that after rest, all anger towards Basil should pass. Unfortunate Basil had been standing under Theo's office for several days. Monet felt sorry for the man, because he was gathering information about Irene because he wanted Theo to be safe. The prince seems to have had a heart of stone because he wanted to drive the unfortunate Basil out of the palace. According to Theo, Basil was not good at his duties and always misplaced documents. Monet offered to speak to Basil in person before ordering him around. If Theo could have done it differently, he would have done it. Theo was shocked that Irene herself asked for a transfer to another place of work. She wanted to be away from the prince. It occurred to Monet that the girl was angry and resentful of Theo, but she could be understood. Theo was going to go over to Irene and talk to her, but he was afraid it would only get worse. The prince was upset because he was convinced that Irene no longer belonged to him. Monet was always surprised, because for the prince it was more difficult than fighting on the battlefield. The woman noticed that Theo was changing for the better. The prince wondered if Monet had spoken to Basil. Theo wanted to know why Irene looked like the divine avatar. He believed that Basil was perhaps more knowledgeable about the matter. Monet has been too busy lately, so she forgot to ask Basil about it. Monet decided not to waste time and to talk to Basil as soon as possible. There was nowhere to pull, because Theo's condition was not too good. Basil, hearing such strange news from Monet, immediately rushed to the prince's office. The man was shocked that the servant showed signs of divine revelation. Theo said that only Monet saw it. The woman confirmed that she is sure of the authenticity of what she saw. Basil understood that Irene was most likely blessed by heaven. It became clear to Basil why Irene was able to read the ancient language, since the avatars were fluent in it. Theo asked Basil to think carefully, because the temple was following all the events. The prince wondered if there was any way to find out more accurate information. Basil said that this will only be known at the ceremony. If everything is really so, then a mark should appear on Irene's body. The prince was completely confused. He became extremely curious whether the sign would appear in the avatar announced by the church, that is, in Sonia. After all, everything pointed to the fact that Sonia Dale is not Avatar Theo at all. It was rumored that the temple held its own ceremony. It was private. It was as if a mark appeared on the body of the divine avatar, but no one could know if it was true. Theo suspected something, because it was strange that the ceremony that the temple wanted to hold was held in secret. The prince remembered the words of the Marquis, because the man explained that he was trying to find out who Irene was. Theo noted that Hales was quite observant. He might have suspected something too. Theo asked if Basil's father would be able to perform the ceremony. Of course, a man could do it, because he had such powers. Theo had a brilliant idea. He asked to bring Irene immediately. Until this moment, Theo was not interested in what the temple was doing. But now it was Irene, so it was different. The prince decided not to waste time and went to Evan. The maids asked if Theo was on his way to the prince. Without answering the question, the man immediately asked where Irene was. The girl was nowhere to be found. There was a letter on the table, and Monet insisted that it should be read. Theo immediately understood that the girl had most likely left. The prince's heart sank with pain, and he could not believe it. The day before, the girl came to Evan and told her that she had decided to quit. Irene had younger brothers and a sister, and her mother was chronically ill. Irene learned that her mother's illness had worsened. Prince Evan made sure that Irene was not resigning because of his brother and decided to give her consent. Evan suggested that Irene take a few days off instead of quitting. Irene could not do this because she herself did not know when she would be able to return. Prince Evan asked for a carriage to be prepared so that Irene could return home. This was compensation for the forced transfer from work to Prince Theo. Irene regretted that she had never informed His Majesty Theo of her departure. The girl was already standing on the threshold of her house. Sister Belle met her. Other family members were also incredibly happy. Irene noticed that the children had grown up a lot during the time when they had not seen each other. Dave got so tall, and Kathy grew long hair. Irene immediately inquired about her mother's well-being. The woman felt bad and took more medicine. She lay tired and exhausted in bed. Belle said that Molly's doctor had recently come and told her that the medicine was no longer helping her mother. Erin hoped that she could somehow help her mother. It was raining like a bucket outside. It was a good thing that Molly gave the medicine, because it should last until the next day. Irene called Belle for help because she was very scared. Mom screamed frantically and moaned in pain. Blood began to flow from the woman's mouth. It was quite a frightening phenomenon. The girls were horrified to notice that the medicine had run out. Irene decided to go immediately to get medicine, because there was no other way out. She could not watch her mother suffer. Belle convinced that it was very dangerous. The doctor even left a few days ago. Irene promised that she would definitely find the medicine elsewhere and asked her sister to look after her mother. Despite the heavy downpour, Irene, not afraid of anything, went to look for medicine. It occurred to the girl that the Viscount might have the medicine. The guards of the Viscount's estate saw someone approaching them. Irene introduced herself and said that she had once worked as a maid in this place and asked to call the butler. The guards stubbornly did not want to let the girl inside. The girl could not stand it and asked the butler to tell her name, Irene. She was convinced that the man would definitely recognize her. The guards were too strict and repeated once again that the entrance was closed. They held out the sharp tip of the sword in front of Irene. The girl begged the men to open up to her because the medicine was needed urgently. One of the guards tried to push Irene away, stubbornly standing her ground. Suddenly, Monet appeared in front of Irene, who knocked her husband to the ground with one blow. The woman inquired about Irene's well-being. Monet noticed that Irene was soaking wet and offered to go inside. The girl assumed that if Monet is here, then maybe she is with Theo. Entering the room, Irene saw His Princely Majesty. The man could not understand why Irene wanted to enter this estate in such weather and at such a late hour. Irene said that she was looking for medicine that her mother urgently needed. The girl, seeing the butler, asked if there were medicines for her mother in their house. Irene was very worried, and her heart was beating too fast. Viscount Ashton wanted to know the reason why the man had come such a long way to him. Theo said that he came for Irene. The girl was shocked, but could not take her eyes off the prince. It occurred to Irene that Theo had come to find out the reason for her dismissal. She asked to give her medicine as soon as possible, because there was no time at all. Her mother was very ill, so it was necessary to save her. Theo hugged Irene tightly. He understood that the girl had difficult family circumstances. Dvoretsky rushed to find medicine. The man brought everything that was in the house and put it on the table. The butler and the viscount asked what kind of medicine Irene needed. The girl was in such a hurry that she completely forgot to ask Belle the name of the medicine. All Irene could say was that she needed medicine for a bad cough. Prince Theo asked Monet to find a cure for such symptoms. The prince detained Irene and asked her to wait a moment. He wanted to take her home. Irene objected, saying that she would take care of everything herself. Theo gave Irene his jacket because the girl was soaked through. The man wanted to ask Irene a lot of questions, but he knew very well that it could wait. Irene explained that the mother was in critical condition, and it was necessary to hurry. Theo promised to get Irene home as soon as possible, saying that he was the best rider. The prince gently took the girl's hand and squeezed it lightly. Theo put Irene on the horse and asked her to relax and lean on him. The girl showed the prince the right way. The man asked to hold on as hard as possible so as not to fall off the horse. Irene also pointed out a shorter way. The girl could feel the prince's breath, and it calmed her down quite a bit. By the time they got there, the rain had stopped. Irene sincerely thanked her husband for kindly giving her a lift. Theo also helped the girl get off the horse. She hugged him and looked gratefully into his eyes. Their eyes met. Suddenly, Irene heard crying and decided that her younger brother had woken up. The prince hurried Irene home. While the girl was walking, he followed her with his eyes. Irene laid out the medicine and inquired about her mother's well-being. Fortunately, the coughing stopped, but the mother lay unconscious. Belle helped Irene lift her mother up to give her the medicine. The girl was convinced that soon her mother would be much better. The children looked gratefully at Irene because she courageously went to look for medicine despite the heavy rain. Irene was relieved. Theo helped her a lot. If it were not for the prince, it is not known whether the mother would have waited for the medicine. Irene decided to leave for a while because she wanted to thank Theo. The girl went out into the yard, then noticed that Theo was still waiting for her. He approached the girl, saying that he understood how much he loved her. The prince's love was even stronger than he could have imagined. Hearing these words, Irene threw herself into her husband's arms. The girl started to cry and said that she was very sad. Theo also admitted that he could not find a place for himself. The young people held each other tightly and did not want to let go. The girl felt how hard her husband's heart was beating. Irene felt calmer. She was very comfortable in the arms of her lover because she missed these feelings so much. Not losing a moment, Theo asked if the reason for Irene's dismissal was her mother's illness. But it turned out that the girl did not resign. Theo personally saw her resignation letter. Irene said that everything is not like that at all. As it turned out, Irene wrote a statement and was already going to give it, but Prince Evan gave her time off. The girl gladly accepted such an offer and was grateful to him. Irene smiled and explained to Prince Evan that as soon as the circumstances improved, she would return to work again. Prince Theo got mad at Basil for shoving a statement in his face saying that Irene had quit. Theo was convinced that Irene only quit because she was angry with him. Irene objected, but Theo knew very well that she really resented him because without warning, she transferred to Evan. Irene wanted to think things over, moving away from the prince. She needed to sort out her feelings. The insult to her husband had a strong effect on her. Theo, in turn, apologized for not stopping Basil's investigation, but it didn't start because he suspected Irene. The prince was absolutely sure that Irene was not a spy. Theo understood Irene's feelings and accepted that she was disappointed and angry. The man sincerely repented. Apologizing can be both simple and very difficult. Irene was sure that it would be difficult for the prince to do this. Prince Theo is one of the most important people in the empire. This move was very sweet of him. The girl appreciated the man's act. He dared to apologize and admit his guilt. Theo called Monet. He wondered if the woman had told Basil about Irene's revelation. Monet replied that she was not yet ready to tell him everything. The woman insisted on leaving as soon as possible because someone could notice the absence of the prince. Theo decided that he could tell Basil later, but only after things had settled down with Irene. A few days later, the prince sent a doctor to Irene. The man began to examine the patient. He apologized, lowered his head, and declared the woman dead. Everyone in the house was terrified. The mother, who was so loved by the children, went to heaven. The very next day there was a woman's grave in the garden. It was difficult for the children to bear such pain, but due to the mother's illness, her death was inevitable. Irene hoped that her mother would no longer be ill in heaven. The girl loved her mother with all her heart. It was very difficult to accept the death of a loved one. The children remained orphans. Theo left a letter for Irene, saying that he would be there very soon. Their meeting was to take place at the same place as last time, near the Viscount's estate. After wiping her tears, Irene immediately went to the meeting place. It was hard for the prince to watch his beloved suffer. The man also chastised himself for not being able to be there on such a difficult and exciting day for the girl. Irene cried bitterly again, tears dripping from her eyes. She immediately ran to Theo and hugged him tightly. The girl was very sorry that the prince was able to come so late because she needed him very much. Irene, hugging Theo, felt much calmer and calmed down a little. The prince shared her feelings with Irene and tried to find the right words to somehow comfort the girl. Theo once again apologized for Irene having to be alone. He understood with all his heart how difficult it was for her. The husband promised not to leave his beloved again. She spent some more time in the arms of her lover. Theo helped Irene to the bed. The girl could not calm down and stop crying. She sincerely thanked Theo because he had taken such care of her since the first meeting. The man looked at his beloved, pitying her. The man tried to cheer up Irene. He started a conversation that was connected only with good memories. It was difficult for the prince to watch his beloved go through difficult times for herself. Irene left a little and decided to tell that their first meeting happened much earlier than Theo thought. The man was surprised because he did not remember anything like this at all. He was convinced that he would definitely notice the girl. Irene said that they first met before Theo went to war. That day, the man wrapped a handkerchief around Irene's injured leg, and after that, there was a meeting in the garden, on the bench where the girl was sitting. Theo remembered the events Irene had talked about. The man said that Irene's wound was serious, so he used a handkerchief. It immediately occurred to the man that he had met Sonia much later. Theo realized that he had met Irene first. The man decided not to hide anything and to tell his beloved everything he knew, and the reason why he had to collect all the data for Irene's check. Theo reminded his lover of the day they had first been to the temple for the farewell ceremony for the queen. This day, Monet saw something strange. Then Theo also saw the light during the ceremony. The man only now realized that the light was probably above them both at once. But since they were a little further from each other, no one could know this. Irene smiled, assuming that Monet had made a mistake, and it wasn't her at all. Theo held Irene to him. The man stated the fact that they met for the first time a long time ago, and it became clear the reason why he managed to survive. The man realized that he was alive, only thanks to the meeting with Irene. After Theo returned to the palace, he remembered meeting Irene, but he wasn't sure that it was her. The man became firmly convinced that Irene is his divine avatar. The girl refused to believe it because she believed that it was simply impossible, and the church had already approved the girl who was a saint. Theo suggested that Irene immediately go to the capital with her brothers and sisters and finally find out if she is an avatar or not. Irene was lost in her thoughts. She couldn't understand why she didn't know about it and didn't even feel anything. It was difficult for the girl to accept the man's words and to believe in their accuracy and seriousness because she is an ordinary maid. Irene was completely confused. Soon, as Theo wanted, they all went to the capital as a group. The children looked at the huge estate, but could not believe that they would live in it. Irene's family was quite poor, so the children were not used to seeing such beauty. Irene believed that it was necessary to thank the prince for having prepared such a wonderful home for her family. Monet convinced that the house was not the best, and asked to be patient for a few days. The girl considered this house very decent, so she convinced Monet that this house would be quite enough for them. Monet had a different opinion, for once upon a time he was not good enough for His Majesty the Prince. Monet invited the children to go inside because the servants were already waiting for them there, who were ready to show everything. Monet asked Irene to go with her to the temple because Prince Theo was already there waiting for her. Moneta and Irene came to the courtyard of the temple. The man asked if the girl wasn't tired from the road because she had been through a lot without it. Irene thanked her for her concern, assuring her that she was perfectly fine. The girl asked if anyone else would be present at the ceremony. She could not believe that the temple servants already knew everything. Theo said that this is a closed part of the temple and no one can go there anymore. Irene turned her head and saw Basil and Vatten. Basil approached Irene, bowed, and apologized profusely for his rudeness. To justify himself, the man explained that he had conducted the investigation for the protection of His Majesty. Basil had not meant to make Irene uncomfortable, but he was still ashamed of what he had done. The girl asked not to worry, because everything remained in the past. Irene wondered what kind of people were with Basil. One of the men was called Chent. He was the father of Basil and was a priest. This man was about to perform an initiation ceremony. Irene looked awkwardly at Chent. Basil informed his father that last time he had told him about the revelation that had taken place. From the beginning, Chent couldn't believe it. The man could not even think that the chief priest, whom he followed and trusted, would lie. Everything was ready for the ceremony, and Theo decided not to delay, but to start right away. Chent asked Irene to step inside the circle. The girl was a little scared, because she had never done anything like this before. With careful and uncertain steps, Irene still went to where Chent asked. Meanwhile, Basil held the candle. Everyone watched Priest Chent and Irene with intrigue. The man admitted that he was very worried about this ceremony. According to His Majesty Theo, Irene was a true divine avatar. Chent understood the seriousness because they had to trick the temple to get to this place. It was necessary to find the truth that was hidden. Chent announced that he was starting the ceremony. Irene and everyone present noticed a very bright light. It was as if a strong wind was swirling inside the temple. It was an extraordinary sight. Behind Irene, transparent illuminated wings grew and butterflies circled. Theo was shocked by what he saw, but silently watched everything. The man asked if Monet had seen this phenomenon last time. The woman confirmed that everything was exactly like that. Basil couldn't believe his eyes. He doubted to the last that Irene was really Theo's avatar. After a brief glow, Irene fell to the floor in agony. Worried, Theo immediately ran up and took his beloved in his arms. A mark appeared on her leg that had never been there before. This was definitive proof that Irene was indeed the avatar. Chent could not immediately translate what was written on the sign, but the man was absolutely sure that it was a divine seal, which proved the fact that Irene was indeed a divine avatar. The emperor trusted the temple very much, but it turned out that the temple servants had forged the results of the revelation. Theo realized that he and Irene were really close, and the church was drowning in lies. Watten and Chent were on their knees, bowing their heads before Prince Theo. His Majesty asked the men to stand up, knowing full well that they were only following the orders of the high priest. Theo informed the men that he had no intention of accusing them, especially since Priest Chant was the father of his right-hand man, Basil. The prince, on the other hand, thanked Vatten and Chent because they helped to conduct the revelation ceremony. Theo realized with regret that the men could lose their jobs after what they had done. Theo decided to meet and talk to his brother Evan. That day, he admitted to Evan that he had some problems, explaining that he and Irene had just returned from the temple. Evan did not quite understand what his brother was implying. The man had no idea what Theo was doing in the temple with the maid and why he looked quite agitated. Theo mustered up the courage to report that the divine avatar appointed by the church had turned out to be false. The man was very worried, but mechanically took Irene's hand. After a short pause, Theo announced that the real avatar is Irene. Evan could not believe it, but it occurred to him that his brother had completely lost his mind. Theo and Irene held hands, glancing at each other from time to time. They sincerely hoped that Evan would believe them. Evan immediately asked if there was any evidence for this claim. Theo looked at his brother from under his forehead, not understanding how it could be otherwise. Theo said that he had several witnesses who could confirm everything. Theo kindly asked Irene to lift her dress and show the sign. The girl lowered her eyes and did everything her lover asked. Theo explained to his brother that everything that happened in the temple left its mark on the body. This inscription was the seal of the divine avatar. At one time, Theo learned that revelation can happen after a special ceremony. For this reason, the man took Irene to the temple. According to the priest who conducted the ceremony, it was divine language. Theo was very curious what would happen if they refuted the temple's position. Theo explained to his brother that the fake ceremony was secret. No one was there except the chief priest, who later declared that the revelation had taken place. Prince Theo was certain that Sonia Dale had never shown signs of being a divine avatar. Evan listened to his brother's stories, but considered it madness. The man wanted to know who else had seen with their own eyes that Irene had a revelation. The girl was not sure, but still said that it was possible that Marquis Fold had somehow noticed it. Evan thought about it, because it seemed to him that the Marquis was trying to hint to him about this. The man at one point began to bring Evan from there about how the temple managed donations. As it turned out, some of the temple projects to which funds from the fund were directed were not genuine. It looked like the funds were stolen, but there was not enough evidence for this. Theo was shocked and could not believe that the emperor knew about everything and was silent. Evan admitted that the emperor hardly knew anything. Prince Evan and other influential people could not catch the Theological Support Fund red-handed. Evan believed that the first thing to do was to find out where the money had gone. The man had previously tried to get more detailed information. Prince Evan looked at Irene, thinking he must address her as a divine avatar. Evan could not even think that Mrs. Avatar would become his assistant. The girl was very shy, so she denied everything, whispering that she was still Irene, and she was a servant in the imperial palace. Irene could not accept that she was a divine avatar. She had no idea how an ordinary maid could become an avatar. Irene came off vacation and returned to her job. Colleagues were very happy that the girl had finally put her affairs in order, because they were quite worried about her. Irene smiled and thanked. She inquired how the days were spent in the palace and whether anything interesting had happened. The girls talked sweetly for a long time. Until that moment, Irene was scared, but later she realized that her loved ones were with her, so everything was fine. She also had evidence that she was the prince's divine avatar. The girl thought and wondered if this explained all the strange coincidences that had happened before, and if these were signs of fate. Before that, Irene prayed a lot, even when she was not yet a servant in the palace. She prayed even after she was hired. When Irene first met the prince, she prayed that he would return from the war alive. Irene didn't know if her words were actually heard because of the revelation. Irene had a small hope that she could love His Majesty. After thinking about everything, she assumed that there would hardly be a place for their love. Irene had no idea why the mark appeared on her leg. The girl was just looking at her sign, and Theo suddenly entered the room. The man came to ask if Irene had shown this sign to anyone. Irene didn't even think of that. For general safety, Theo had a bandage with him, which he wrapped around the girl's leg, covering the mark. Irene asked the prince's opinion what he thought about the place where the sign appeared. It occurred to the girl that the prince first of all touched this place on her leg when he wrapped her leg with a handkerchief. Irene laughed. The man noticed that she was very observant. It wouldn't even occur to him. Theo looked at Irene as she laughed. Her smile seemed to enchant him. Theo tried to forget the day he and Irene met because he had bad memories. As it turned out, the prince was not in good spirits because he had lost a bet to his brother. Irene treated her husband's feelings with understanding and respect. Theo was very troubled by the fact that he could not remember the day of their first meeting, because that day was terrible for him for other reasons, so he tried to erase it from his memory. It was the first time Theo looked so scared. Irene thought about the prince's feelings, what he thought, what he felt, and what kind of person he was. The man could not stand it and hugged Irene tightly. His heart always beat faster when he was near his beloved. The desire to hug Irene every time we met was irresistible. The man told Irene that he hugged her because he liked her very much. Irene looked scared. It was unusual for her to be in such a position. The girl felt fear and anxiety, and it weighed on her. Theo gently kissed the girl, saying that everything is fine. He was next to Irene, and it seemed to him that everything would be fine. As long as Theo was near, these words to Irene did not seem like an illusion, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Irene and Theo decided to go to the imperial palace to tell about everything. The lovers held hands and seemed happy. Having gone inside, the young people saw Sonia, who was ahead of them, and had already managed to tell something to the emperor. The father was just waiting for his son. He was not very happy, because he had information that Theo had ignored Sonia again. Theo had already told his father that he had a girlfriend, but the Emperor seemed to have missed it. The Emperor was outraged because a maid was standing next to his son. Sonia Dale has already managed to inform her husband that his son's lover is an ordinary maid. The Emperor got angry and got up from his chair. He approached his son, claiming that he was refusing to contact his own divine avatar for the maid. Theo could not stand the pressure of his father, and pointing at Irene, he said that this girl is his real avatar. Enraged, Theo shouted that he had chosen Irene himself. All his life, Theo could not do anything of his own free will, and his father again did not let him choose, this time, a loved one. Father claimed that he too was the Emperor, and that was normal. Evan entered the hall, wanting to urgently talk to his father. Since Evan was more calm than Theo, his father always treated him more favorably. Evan told his father that he did not understand anything. The man put documents on the table, which talked about the temple and the corruption of the chief priest. Evan looked at Sonia, who was standing next to his father. Marquis Hales came to Evan the day before. He reported that Irene had an audience with His Majesty, about which the temple did not know, because the Marquis did not want to act so unscrupulously and did not say anything. Hales handed the documents to Prince Evan, assuring him that they would be useful to the man. The documents contained all the information the Marquis could gather about the church's finances. After carefully reading everything, Evan came to the conclusion that this would greatly shake the position of the temple. Hales already knew everything about Irene at this time. At first, Evan thought that the Marquis had given him the papers to make a good impression on him. Eventually, Evan realized that Hale had only good intentions and wanted nothing in return. Marquis just wanted Evan to protect Irene. Prince Evan announced loudly that he had already heard that the temple was embezzling donations, and some of their projects were bogus, such as Sonia Dale. The Emperor was sure that Evan did not understand what he was saying. The man was convinced that helping the divine avatar needed funds, and that was the work of the temple. Theo shouted that Sonia was not a divine avatar. The Emperor was on edge. He was filled with intense anger. He believed that his sons were insulting him with such accusations, and he convinced them that blasphemy is a mortal sin. Sonia took the side of the Emperor, supporting his words that men brazenly desecrated the temple. The woman claimed that the revelation that came to her was revealed in the church. Theo could barely contain himself. He approached Irene and asked to show Sonia what she didn't have. The girl unwound the bandage, under which the blessed sign was hidden. The Emperor was shocked. He had no idea how this was possible. Theo explained that after the ceremony, a seal appeared on Irene's leg, and since God is one, there could only be one avatar. Theo was firmly convinced that Irene was the avatar. Prince Evan demanded that Sonia not be ashamed and show evidence that would confirm her condition. The men were unanimously convinced that she would not be able to do it. Sonia silently lowered her head. The church tried for a long time to reach a high position, even attempted to encroach on the authority of the imperial family. Theo was convinced that they had used what had happened to him and put a fake one in place of the real avatar. The Emperor looked at Sonia Dale, demanding an explanation. The girl was only able to say that she was in love with Theo. The Emperor turned to Irene, addressing her by name. The man apologized because he didn't know what was really going on, and in his opinion, he did the wrong thing. His Majesty realized the seriousness of what had happened. The man got down on one knee in front of Irene and asked for forgiveness. The Emperor vowed that he would punish the temple that hid the identity of the true divine avatar. The man once again sincerely repented in front of Irene because he blindly trusted the head priest and those around him. Good-natured Irene easily forgave the Emperor because he was the father of her lover. The man blindly believed the church because he was convinced of the correctness of its decisions. Irene asked His Majesty to rise from her knees because she was uncomfortable. When everyone left the Emperor's hall, they met Lauren. The woman already knew everything, so she hugged Irene. Lauren was a little offended because she learned about the divine avatar quite late. The woman looked angrily at Theo because he didn't tell her anything. Lauren and Theo always had arguments and fights. Evan called out to Irene and Theo. The man firmly decided that war should be declared against the temple. Prince Evan also announced that Irene will no longer work as a maid. Prince Evan took the key that the servant brought him. The man handed Irene the key, saying that it was hers now that she had become their dear guest. Evan could not allow the divine avatar to live in a poor house, so he decided that she would live in a palace. Before, Irene didn't know what it meant to get a key. Arriving in her new home, Irene met a maid who was ready to start her duties and serve Irene by order of the emperor. The maid immediately offered Irene to change her clothes. The girl immediately recognized her colleague, and it all seemed strange to her, because before they were friends who shared joys and sorrows and also supported each other. Irene did not want to listen to anything and decided to pick up clothes and dress herself. In a few minutes, Irene was standing in her new outfit. Looking at herself in the mirror, the girl thought that she looked too elegant. Shy Irene assured Evra that she did not need the girl's help. Irene let Evra go, saying she was free. Evra just laughed, but denied Irene's words. Evra explained that she had to carry out the emperor's order, and he instructed her to take care of the girl. The servant assured Irene that she was honored to help her friend find her happiness. Evra wanted to go out into the yard and told Irene to call her when she needed something. Irene was sitting in a chair and looking out the window. The girl could not imagine that everything could change like that. Theo believed that it was necessary to start a confrontation with the temple. The husband also asked his beloved not to worry about her brothers and sisters because the maids were already looking after them. According to Theo, Sonia Dale was arrested. He was convinced that the temple would learn this news very quickly. The man did not reject the idea that the head of the church might try to harm Irene. As a member of the emperor's family, Theo was determined to protect the divine avatar and was fully prepared to confront the temple. The man hugged Irene and asked her not to worry. Theo was aware that they had a difficult road ahead of them. Irene was afraid that His Majesty was very disappointed, but in spite of everything, she sincerely hoped that everything would be fine, and everything would definitely work out for them. Theo, Monet, and Basil got on their horses, and together they set off into the distance. Aaron stood, seeing off the young people, and they looked in their wake. Irene sincerely believed that everything would end very quickly, and Vin and Theo would be able to be together. The girl began a sincere prayer, realizing that she would definitely help Theo. Meanwhile, the chief priest was simply beside himself with anger. He did not think that a true divine avatar would ever appear. The man understood that the temple would soon collapse, so he decided to save himself. Under the pressure of fear, the chief priest opened the chest with jewels and began to take everything from there. The man did not have time. Monet appeared in his room, who was convinced that the priest was going to run away. The chief priest began to shout that this is a holy place. Monet believed that now the priest definitely had no right to speak like that. The priest was captured by men who were going to accompany him to the imperial palace. The man understood that very soon his end would come. With his last strength, he tried to scream and demand to be let go. He threatened the men that God saw everything, and they would be punished. Basil intervened, understanding all the wretchedness of the chief priest. This man had tried to run away a few minutes before, and then, as if nothing had happened, he was covered by God. Theo, seeing the head priest, became angry. He had waited too long for this moment. The priest tried to say something, but Theo did not want to listen to him at all. He explained to the brat that he committed the crime by turning away from God's will, trying to use his fate for his own purposes. Theo threatened the priest that he would definitely pay for his actions. Meanwhile, Irene looked out the window every moment, seeing her lover there. Finally, near the estate, the girl saw her lover. She hugged him tightly, but was happy that her husband had returned. Theo had only been gone for a few days, but Irene greeted him as if he had been gone forever. She was very worried and constantly prayed for her husband. Theo complimented his beloved, saying that she was very beautiful in such an elegant dress. The girl lowered her eyes because it was hard for her to hear such a thing. She could not get used to the new outfit at all. Suddenly, everyone started addressing Irene as Mrs. They said that Irene should not do everything herself, because there were servants for that. The girl felt very embarrassed in such a situation. Irene asked Theo to speak to his father and ask His Majesty to rescind his order. Theo smiled, but said he could, but it wouldn't work. Theo did not want, but could not allow his beloved to be treated as before, because she deserved more. The man asked not to return to this topic again. Young people passionately kissed. Meanwhile, the maids whispered in amazement that the divine avatar had always, all this time, been among them. Women considered such an event simply incredible. Theo noticed that Irene continued to worry that someone would notice them. The prince was very pleased to meet Irene again in this very place. The girl abruptly took her husband's hand and offered to go to the bedroom. Theo was convinced that his beloved was teasing him again. He immediately lifted her in his arms and went inside the estate. Entering the room, Theo carefully placed Irene on the bed. Their lips gently touched each other. Passionate kisses did not make themselves wait long. Theo raised his head and said that Irene would soon be able to forget about the maid uniform. Irene noticed that Theo seemed to be in a hurry. The man laughed and assured the girl that she should take responsibility for her inappropriate request. Young people began to love. Afterwards, Theo announced that a so-called dinner was to be held the next day. Irene was absolutely sure that no dinner was planned. She wondered why such a dinner was decided to be organized. Theo looked at his beloved and smiled. The girl looked at the prince in confusion, not understanding what he meant. It turned out that the invited dinner was to announce Irene to the upper world. Irene pulled the blanket over herself in fear. She became afraid because she well understood that all attention would be focused on her. The girl believed that she would not be able to even eat when everyone was looking at her. Irene was not mentally prepared for such an event. Theo asked not to worry, because he will be there and will definitely support the girl. Theo looked mysteriously at Irene and said that someone should help her tomorrow. This person was supposed to call on Irene the next day around this time. The girl was intrigued because Theo kept the man's name a secret. Theo meant his sister Lauren, but decided to make a surprise for his beloved. The man only reported that when he asked this woman to help Irene, she gladly agreed and was very happy. The next day, Lauren opened the door to Irene's room. As it turned out, the girl was still sleeping sweetly, and they had to leave the Gezabar by now. The princess decided not to waste time and immediately called all the servants. The girls ran around Irene, handing her dress after dress. One of them suited the girl perfectly, and she looked beautiful in it. Prince Theo entered the room and was almost speechless. Irene was so beautiful that the man could not utter a single word. The prince looked at his beauty in silence. Theo thanked Lauren for her help, shook his hand, and they were ready to leave. Theo believed that he was the one to introduce his divine avatar. The servants blew their trumpets and announced the arrival of the emperor. It seemed to Irene that everyone was looking only at her. The emperor wanted to make an important announcement before the dinner began. The emperor said that the temple belongs to their deity and must be righteous in everything. But he deceived the empire by presenting a false divine avatar. Everyone present could not believe what they heard. The emperor also said that the church had managed to deceive even him. The servants of the church put dust in the eyes of the imperial family, acting for their own reasons. The emperor considered this a terrible crime. He was very disappointed in the temple because of this incident. The man promised to deal with the culprits. Pointing to Irene, the emperor calmly and joyfully said that there was a true divine avatar among them. The authenticity of this incarnation was proven at the revelation ceremony. The emperor was ready to show the people proof of this. Irene lifted her dress, and everyone present saw the seal of the true divine avatar on her leg. A few days have passed. Irene went to the prison to see Sonia Dale. On the way to the women's cell, the prisoners tried to extend their hands to Irene and asked for mercy. Irene went to Sonia's cell and wanted to talk to her. Before, Sonia could not think that Irene would turn out to be a real messenger of God. But at this time, the girl stood in front of her and looked at her, in Sonia's opinion, as if she were nothing. After listening to Sonia, Irene said that she would like to release the woman from this prison because she did not consider her a thief. It occurred to Sonia that Irene simply felt sorry for her. The woman looked at Irene with a sad, but at the same time nervous look, and said that if it weren't for her, Her Majesty Theo would be next to her. Sonia was always jealous of Irene, and her heart broke into 1,000 pieces every time because the prince loved only her, even though she was not a divine incarnation. Irene was convinced that she and Sonia were somehow similar. The girl learned that Sonia could never rely on her parents, brothers, or sisters. Since childhood, she worked for the sake of the family and the church. The church, taking advantage of Sonia's kindness, used her. Since Sonia had no one to rely on, there was nothing left but to go to the temple servants on a leash. Irene did not consider Sonia a thief at all. Avatar wanted to give Sonia a chance, because when a person lived for someone, he forgot about his own needs. The girl believed that when given a chance, a person began to understand what he really wanted. Irene didn't want anyone to use Sonia ever again. Irene was warmed by the thought that a woman would finally be able to think about her own feelings. After becoming a divine avatar, Irene became much stronger. Having finished the conversation, Irene left and gave Sonia the opportunity to think things through and make the right decision. The girl approached the Marquis and asked to give her a couple of minutes. Hale congratulated Irene on her new top. The Marquis was glad that he had taken part in uncovering the lie and that justice had finally prevailed. Irene guessed that the Marquis knew about everything from the very beginning. The man believed that fate itself indicated to him that Irene was a real divine incarnation. Suddenly, an angry Theo appeared near the young people. The man was beside himself because the Marquis was again clinging to Irene. The girl tried to calm her lover down. The Marquis congratulated Irene and Theo and wished them a good rest. Hales turned and started to walk away. Theo shouted words of thanks to the man, because without his help, it would be difficult to prove the dirty deeds of the church. Irene was very afraid that Theo would be angry with the Marquis. But the prince only thanked Hales. Irene smiled, because her husband was changing for the better before her eyes. Irene did pretty well with the ceremony, which Theo couldn't help but cheer on. The girl thought that after becoming an avatar, standing next to the prince in front of so many people was so strange and unsurpassed. The prince always received a lot of attention to his person, and he convinced the girl that she would quickly get used to it. Theo looked lovingly at Irene and whispered that she was his destiny. The man showered his beloved with compliments. Irene smiled and said in return that the prince looked great too. Theo was special to Irene from the very first time they met, and incredibly attractive. Theo heard words of thanks from his beloved for being by her side and supporting her that day. Theo admitted that during the separation he felt too broken and his life force seemed to have disappeared. He missed his beloved very much. The man got down on one knee in front of Irene and wanted to always be next to her, all his life. The prince gently kissed the girl's hand and offered to marry him. Tears of joy flowed from Irene's eyes. Theo was frightened, not understanding the reason why his beloved was crying. Earlier, the girl thought that she would have to give up her love. At this exciting moment, she seemed to be flying on the wings of happiness. Theo confessed his love to Irene, telling her how much he loved her. The girl reciprocated. It was the best day of her life. Belle was overjoyed because her sister was getting married to the prince himself. Only the brother was sad, but did not want to let go of the older sister. Belle was happy that her favorite sister and Theo loved each other. She sincerely congratulated her, because this is such an important step in the life of every girl. The bride was waiting for the door to open, because at that moment the ceremony was about to begin. All her life, Irene wanted to be happy, and this moment in her life had come. At the end of the wedding, the newlyweds exchanged wedding rings. From that moment on, they became a happy husband and wife. The newlyweds couldn't wait to know what awaited them in the future.